It began with a small brown package, neat handwriting, perfect weight, no return address. A judge opened it in his own kitchen. In less than a second, the mail became a weapon. The blast tore through Birmingham, but what it revealed was larger than the crime itself. A mind so meticulous, it mirrored the system it despised. Walter Leroy Moody wasn't driven by chaos. He was driven by order. Every wire cut to length, every label typed twice, every grievance documented like evidence. He built bombs the way the courts wrote, line by line, without emotion. For 30 years, the Bureau would chase him through his own logic. Every signature, every thread, every word was a clue written in the grammar of control. The investigation that followed would outlast presidencies, technologies, and even the man himself. It would turn paranoia into procedure, vengeance into protocol. Because when one man tried to destroy the law through precision, the law answered with greater precision still. The case began with fire. It ended in order. The morning of December 16, 1989, began in silence across the wooded hills of Mountain Brook, Alabama. The air carried a damp chill, the kind that clung to rooftops and driveways under the soft overcast of winter. Christmas lights glowed faintly against the pale sky. In the home of United States Circuit Judge Robert Smith Vance, the day began like any other weekend morning. The coffee pot gurgled, the mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter, and his wife, Helen, moved quietly through the house. Outside, nothing stirred. Inside, a small, square parcel rested by the sink. Plain brown paper, ordinary tape, no sign that it held anything beyond the season's routine. Judge Vance was 68 years old, a respected jurist whose name carried weight across the American South. His career had been built on principle, his rulings measured, his temperament cautious and fair. He had lived long enough to see Alabama change, to witness the courts confront decades of segregation and social unrest. That morning, none of it seemed relevant. The mail had come late. A brown box waited. The tape peeled away beneath his fingers. At 10:20 a.m., the stillness shattered. The package exploded with the violence of a grenade. The detonation tore through the kitchen, ripping through the walls, shattering glass, and igniting smoke thick with the metallic scent of powder. Robert Vance was killed instantly. His wife Helen was thrown backward, gravely wounded but alive. The kitchen became a field of debris, splintered wood, fragments of pipe, twisted nails embedded in plaster. Neighbors heard the blast echo across the block. Within minutes, emergency sirens converged on the quiet street. Firefighters and paramedics pushed through the haze and wreckage, securing what little remained of the room. Investigators from local law enforcement soon followed, quickly realizing this was no domestic accident. The blast radius was compact and precise, the signature of a constructed device. When federal agents from the Birmingham field office arrived, they moved with the urgency reserved for national crises. A federal judge was dead, and the implications were enormous. By noon, word reached Washington. The FBI's main office activated its crisis network, contacting the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and the U.S. Marshals Service. A multi-agency task force began forming before the smoke had cleared. The nation had lost a sitting appellate judge in his own home, killed by a mailed bomb. It was an attack on the judiciary itself. At the crime scene, every object was treated as evidence. Investigators photographed the remains of the parcel, its cardboard edges, its inner wrappings, the fragments of wire and battery casings, scattered across the floor. The bomb technicians collected what they could: the twisted metal of a pipe, the shredded remains of an end cap, traces of smokeless powder. These pieces were bagged, labeled, and shipped to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. Their forensic specialists would attempt to reconstruct the device and determine its design, origin, and the mind behind it. In the meantime, the first theory took shape. Judge Vance's record on civil rights cases was well known. He had ruled on matters of desegregation, voting rights, and criminal justice reform. His death might have been the work of a hate group or a political extremist. That line of reasoning dominated the early hours of the investigation. The timing, days before Christmas, suggested someone with a cruel sense of symbolism. 2 days later, on December 18th, the second explosion confirmed their fears. In Atlanta, Georgia, attorney Robert E. Robinson opened a package in his law office. The device detonated instantly, killing him where he stood. Robinson, a respected black lawyer known for his civil rights work, became the second victim in 3 days. The pattern was undeniable. Two professionals connected to law and civil rights, both targeted by identical parcel bombs, both mailed from within the Southeast. Panic spread through legal offices across the region. Judges ordered their mail isolated. Clerks refused to open packages without inspection. The judiciary had entered lockdown. The FBI expanded its command post, bringing in postal inspectors to trace the packages through distribution centers. Each parcel bore postmarks from the south, the first from Birmingham, the second from Atlanta. Sorting facilities were scoured for fingerprints, chemical residue, or fibers. Postal workers were interviewed in shifts. Thousands of pieces of mail examined. The trail was faint, but one fact was clear. These bombs were mailed by someone meticulous, deliberate, and familiar with postal routing. The task force grew. Agents from the ATF arrived to analyze the blast scenes. They confirmed the devices were nearly identical in design. Short steel pipes filled with explosive powder, sealed with threaded caps, and surrounded by rubber-banded nails for shrapnel. The power source was simple but deadly. A small battery pack wired to a detonator, triggered by the opening motion of the box. The wiring was clean, the construction practiced. Whoever built these bombs had done it before. The federal government moved fast. News outlets across the nation broadcast the story. A federal judge assassinated. A civil rights lawyer murdered. More bombs possibly in the mail. Fear turned to vigilance. In Atlanta, an alert postal worker intercepted a suspicious package addressed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the very court on which Judge Vance had served. Bomb technicians were called in. After hours of tense examination, the device was safely defused. Inside they found the same signature: pipe, nails, batteries, wiring. A fourth bomb was discovered the next day. Addressed to the NAACP office in Jacksonville, Florida, that one too was intercepted before it detonated. Specialists from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office rendered it safe, preserving yet another complete device for forensic study. 4 bombs, 2 exploded, 2 intact, now formed the framework of one of the largest criminal investigations in modern FBI history. Inside the Bureau's command post, a theory began to collapse. The apparent link to civil rights figures was too convenient, too deliberate. The intercepted bombs to the 11th Circuit and NAACP suggested a smokescreen, a way to mislead investigators into assuming racial or political motives. The FBI and ATF shifted focus to technical analysis, but bomb makers' style, component sourcing, and prior cases. Surveillance operations began almost immediately. Agents obtained warrants to monitor Moody's communications, mail, and movements. Teams observed his home in Rex, Georgia. He lived quietly with his new wife, appearing polite to neighbors, reserved, unremarkable. Yet the forensic trail was tightening. Hardware store records showed purchases of metal pipes, end caps, and batteries. Correspondence recovered from his trash revealed obsessive notes about court decisions and the postal system. The FBI laboratory's work completed the circle. Chemical analysis of residue from the bombs confirmed a match to the powder type used in Moody's 1972 device. Microscopic comparisons of tool marks on the pipe caps indicated machining by the same kind of die grinder. Even the handwriting on the mailing labels shared characteristics with samples from Moody's earlier case. The evidence, once circumstantial, was converging into certainty. By early 1990, Moody was under round-the-clock observation. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit profiled him as a methodical loner, intelligent, manipulative, and entirely self-justifying. They believed he acted alone, though he may have used his wife to unwittingly assist in mailings. He displayed obsessive tendencies and rehearsed his alibi in conversations overheard through court-authorized recordings. In monitored jail calls following a minor weapons charge, he muttered to himself about justice and revenge, reinforcing the Bureau's suspicions. As agents sifted through his past, the scale of his grievance became clear. His hatred for the judicial system had grown into fixation. He viewed the 11th Circuit Court as the embodiment of betrayal. Judge Vance, though not personally connected to his original case, symbolized everything Moody despised: authority, reason, finality. To him, killing a judge was not just revenge, it was a statement of power against a system he believed had humiliated him. The investigation, codenamed Van Pack for Vance Package, became a model of interagency cooperation. The FBI, ATF, Postal Inspection Service, IRS, U.S. Marshals, and state police worked side by side. Evidence rooms overflowed with cataloged fragments. Laboratories across the country ran comparative tests. Agents conducted hundreds of interviews, retracing the movement of each bomb from post office to doorstep. The picture that emerged was chilling. A man who had spent years experimenting, refining, and preparing for a strike that would both terrify the judiciary and mislead investigators through deliberate racial misdirection. By the spring of 1990, the evidence was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors began building a case that would tie together all 4 bombs. 2 exploded, 2 intercepted, with the earlier 1972 conviction. The motive was personal vengeance against the courts. The false racial narrative was a diversion. Every detail fit. In the months that followed, Moody was indicted, arrested, and charged with multiple counts, including the murder of Judge Vance and attorney Robert Robinson, as well as attempted murder and obstruction of justice. The case would eventually involve over 200 law enforcement officers, thousands of exhibits, and a mountain of forensic data. When it reached trial, the proceedings would be as meticulous as the investigation itself. But in December 1989, none of that was known. The investigation was only beginning. Across the South, federal courthouses remained under lockdown. Judges checked their mail behind security screens. Postal inspectors wore bomb suits to handle suspicious parcels. The public tension was palpable. The notion that death could arrive through the mail had turned ordinary life into a landscape of fear. In Mountain Brook, the Vance home was sealed. The kitchen preserved as evidence. Helen Vance recovered slowly from her injuries, her life forever marked by that morning's violence. At the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, Judge Vance's colleagues continued their work behind reinforced glass and metal detectors. Across federal offices, new protocols were introduced to protect members of the judiciary. For the Bureau, the mission was clear: to identify, capture, and prosecute the man who had declared war on the courts. The bombing of Judge Robert Vance marked one of the most direct attacks on the American justice system since its founding. The assassin's motive was not ideology or profit, but resentment, and that made him more dangerous. Walter Leroy Moody had transformed a personal grievance into a national tragedy. His name would not appear publicly for another year. But his design, his technique, and his anger were already written across every fragment of steel pulled from the ruins. In the weeks that followed, as the evidence mounted and agents closed in, the story of his decades-long vendetta would begin to unfold. A narrative of precision, vengeance, and obsession that would stretch from the red clay of Georgia to the highest courtrooms of the United States. The prologue ends where the investigation begins, in the aftermath of a single explosion that revealed the fragility of the system it targeted. The FBI's path forward would be methodical, grueling, and relentless. Behind every lead was another false trail, another clue buried beneath years of quiet anger. Before long, the pursuit of Walter Leroy Moody would become one of the largest manhunts in Bureau history, a campaign to restore justice to a system wounded by its own citizens' hate. Monday morning settled over Atlanta, with the usual pulse of business and winter traffic. The Christmas rush had begun to strain the postal routes. Packages filled office lobbies and mailrooms. Brown parcels, some gift-wrapped, others plain, piled by the dozens, in corners and on desks. In the Midtown office of attorney Robert E. Robinson, the start of the week carried no sense of danger. The phones rang, secretaries sorted correspondence, and Robinson, a respected figure in Georgia's legal community, prepared for another day of work. The brown parcel waiting for him was unremarkable, the same size and color as hundreds he had received before. At 9:20 a.m., when he lifted the lid, the room erupted in light and sound. The blast blew out the front window, shredding paper and plaster. Colleagues stumbled from nearby offices into a haze of smoke and dust. Robinson was dead instantly. The second explosion in 3 days confirmed the grim pattern the FBI had feared. Alabama had not been an isolated event. Someone was killing members of the legal profession through the mail. Atlanta police were first on the scene, followed by the city's bomb squad. Within minutes, agents from the FBI's Atlanta field office arrived, establishing a perimeter. The office was torn apart, glass littering the sidewalk, debris scattered across Peachtree Street. Witnesses spoke of a thunderclap, a concussive force that rattled the floors above. For investigators, the parallels to the Birmingham bombing were unmistakable. Same packaging, same design, same calculated intent. By noon, the FBI's command post in Birmingham relayed confirmation. The two incidents, Judge Vance's home and Robinson's law office, shared identical construction signatures: steel pipe, threaded end caps, smokeless powder, nails, C-cell batteries, all packed in boxes, mailed through standard U.S. Postal Service channels. This was a serial bomber, methodical and disciplined. The killer had mailed multiple devices, each timed not by clockwork, but by the simple act of human curiosity. The opening of a box. Federal agents began to coordinate between Atlanta, Birmingham, Jacksonville, and Washington. A joint task force took shape under the supervision of senior bureau leadership, pairing the FBI's counterterrorism division with the ATF's explosives experts and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Each agency brought unique capabilities: forensic reconstruction, bomb signature databases, postal routing analytics, and behavioral profiling. The case was now officially designated a domestic terrorism investigation. News of the second killing spread fast. Television crews descended on Atlanta. Headlines flashed across networks nationwide. The death of a black civil rights attorney, 2 days after the assassination of a federal judge, set off speculation of racially motivated violence. Reporters drew connections to the region's turbulent history, to old resentments, resurfacing in a season meant for peace. For investigators on the ground, that theory was plausible, but unproven. It fit too neatly, too perfectly, to be trusted. Meanwhile, postal inspectors reconstructed the bomb's journey through the mail system. The parcel to Atlanta had been postmarked in the northern suburbs, routed through regional sorting centers, before reaching Robinson's office. Each stop left traces, routing numbers, clerk initials, and ink variations in postmark stamps. Investigators combed through thousands of forms to isolate potential origin points. The bomb to Judge Vance had originated in Birmingham. The one to Robinson appeared to come from the Atlanta area. The pattern implied mobility. The bomber was mailing from multiple cities to obscure his trail. 3 days into the investigation, a third package surfaced. This one was addressed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, the same judicial body where Judge Vance had served. A clerk handling incoming mail noticed similarities in handwriting and packaging and alerted security. The building was evacuated. The Atlanta Police Department's bomb squad and ATF technicians took control of the parcel, X-raying it on site. The image confirmed the presence of a metallic cylinder with wiring. The device was real. After hours of careful disassembly, the bomb was rendered safe, its components intact and undetonated. The safe recovery of this third device gave investigators their most complete evidence yet. The bomb was a mirror image of the first two, down to the length of wire and brand of batteries. Inside, ATF analysts found faint traces of machine oil, suggesting the builder had used precision metal cutting tools in a home workshop. The cardboard box bore microscopic impressions from a typewriter, evidence that the address label had been created with an old manual machine. That same evening, the Jacksonville, Florida branch of the NAACP reported a suspicious parcel nearly identical to the Atlanta court package. Local police were notified, and bomb experts from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office arrived. Following established procedure, they used remote control equipment to open and neutralize the device. Inside, the same pattern repeated: pipe, nails, batteries, and detonator assembly. 4 bombs in total. 2 exploded, 2 intercepted, all traceable to one source. The FBI's command center in Birmingham now bore the codename VN-PAC, shorthand for Vance Package Bombing Investigation. Every day, agents updated whiteboards, listing suspects, evidence counts, and cross-agency reports. The Bureau's laboratory at Quantico worked around the clock. Chemists analyzed powder composition, metallurgists examined the pipe alloy, and document experts compared handwriting samples from thousands of criminal files. It was the largest coordinated forensic effort in the region since the church bombings of the 1960s. As evidence accumulated, the early civil rights motive lost traction. The inclusion of the 11th Circuit Court among the targets suggested something more intricate, perhaps a personal vendetta against the judiciary itself. The mailing to the NAACP looked staged, designed to mislead. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit reviewed the case and proposed a psychological profile. A white male, middle-aged to elderly, technically skilled, harboring resentment toward the legal system, possibly with prior criminal experience involving explosives. The bomber's operational control implied intelligence and patience. He was not improvising under pressure. He was executing a plan years in the making. The pattern of bomb construction became a narrative of its own. Investigators noticed the use of commonly available hardware materials, yet assembled with meticulous uniformity. The builder likely maintained detailed notes, reusing his own design, with minor refinements. His method indicated a personal satisfaction in precision, a sense of craftsmanship rather than chaos. That mindset often pointed toward an individual with mechanical aptitude and an obsessive nature, a former hobbyist engineer or machinist. The Bureau began pulling archived case files on prior domestic bombings with similar signatures. Dozens were reviewed. None matched exactly. Then an ATF technician, revisiting an old logbook, recalled a bomb from the early 1970s with nearly identical mechanical characteristics. It had been recovered in Georgia after exploding inside a man's home, injuring his wife. The builder, convicted of unlawful possession, had served time in federal prison. His name was Walter Leroy Moody. The technician retrieved the 1972 case report. Side-by-side comparison of photographs showed near-perfect similarity. Identical pipe length, same thread pattern, same use of ballpoint pen barrels in the firing mechanism. Even the soldering style was consistent. The old file became the linchpin for a new line of inquiry. Moody had a history of resentment toward the courts that had sentenced him. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Agents verified Moody's current whereabouts. He was living in Rex, Georgia, a suburb southeast of Atlanta, with his second wife. He maintained a quiet existence, no longer under supervision. His criminal record was clear, but his prior conviction for a bomb offense fit the emerging profile. Investigators began surveillance. They examined his background further. Born in 1935 in Georgia, Moody had been a machinist and part-time inventor, intelligent and meticulous. After his conviction in 1972, he had filed numerous appeals, all denied by the courts, including the 11th Circuit. Over the years, he had sent angry letters to judges, newspapers, and federal offices accusing the judicial system of corruption. He viewed himself as wronged and sought recognition as a victim of injustice. The psychological portrait aligned seamlessly with the bomber's motive pattern. While surveillance teams shadowed him, forensic work deepened. Laboratory analysts traced the bomb powder to a specific commercial lot number sold in the southeastern United States. Hardware receipts, recovered from stores around Moody's residence, showed purchases of compatible components, pipe fittings, rubber bands, electrical tape, and battery casings. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, yet investigators remained cautious. They needed irrefutable proof linking Moody to the packages. His mailings had been posted from different cities, each chosen to obscure a single origin point. Agents used postal routing algorithms to triangulate drop-off times and distances, concluding that the bomber likely traveled between Alabama and Georgia in the days preceding the first explosion. Surveillance of Moody's vehicles confirmed multiple long-distance drives matching those timelines. Through December and into January 1990, the case expanded into one of the largest coordinated law enforcement efforts in Southern history. Hundreds of federal employees screened mail daily. Postal inspectors, armed with portable X-ray units, examined thousands of parcels. Public anxiety persisted, but the methodical pace of the investigation was beginning to yield shape and direction. Inside the FBI's evidence rooms, the 4 bombs were reconstructed in controlled chambers. When arranged side by side, their precision was chilling. Every device contained the same solder joints, the same brand of electrical wire, even the same batch of Scotch tape. It was craftsmanship bordering on obsession. Analysts noted that each box label had been typed on the same model of manual typewriter, a mechanical relic nearly obsolete by 1989. The discovery added one more data point to the profile: a man living in the past, surrounded by outdated equipment, clinging to grievances decades old. As 1990 began, agents prepared the next phase: correlation between Moody's earlier conviction and the Van Pack bombs. They compared metallurgical samples from the 1972 case with the new evidence: identical steel composition, identical threading pattern, identical use of galvanized finish. Every test tightened the circle around him. Behavioral analysts warned that the suspect would likely perceive any inquiry as persecution, that he viewed himself as a righteous adversary to the courts, not a criminal. His goal was symbolic retribution. Judge Vance's death was his statement. By the end of January, the investigative framework was complete. Surveillance, forensics, and behavioral evidence all pointed to one man. Yet the Bureau's leadership insisted on exhaustive confirmation. The assassination of a federal judge demanded absolute precision. No wrongful accusation could risk undermining the system the killer sought to attack. In those early weeks after the Atlanta blast, the investigation shifted from chaos to control. The second explosion had transformed a mystery into a pursuit. What began as a pair of isolated tragedies was now a unified narrative. One bomber, 4 devices, a single vendetta. The task force would spend the next year unraveling his every move: purchases, travels, writings, and psychological decay. But the foundation was laid here, amid the shattered glass of an Atlanta office, where a brown parcel turned vengeance into national crisis. The Van Pack Task Force would become a template for multi-agency cooperation, its methods refined through the relentless dissection of every fragment of wire and powder grain. For the Bureau, the murder of Judge Vance and Attorney Robinson was more than homicide. It was an assault on the nation's judicial integrity. The investigators who stood amid the wreckage on December 18, 1989, knew the work ahead would be measured not in days, but in years. And so, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the constant rustle of paperwork, the names of victims and suspects took their place on whiteboards across FBI offices. A web of arrows connected places, postmarks, and times. In the center sat one name, written cautiously in ink, not yet public, but soon to define the case: Walter Leroy Moody. The second blast had ended the season of doubt. Now the pursuit had begun. The tension inside every federal building across the South was immediate and relentless. After the deaths of Judge Robert Vance and Attorney Robert Robinson, no one trusted the mail. Secretaries refused to touch new deliveries, clerks wore gloves, and judges signed rulings behind locked chambers. The Christmas season of 1989 had ended in fear. Every brown parcel was now a potential weapon. In Atlanta, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals had become a fortress. The same institution that had once been a forum for constitutional debate now resembled a sealed compound. Armed U.S. Marshals stood guard by the elevators. Bomb-sniffing dogs patrolled hallways. Even the smallest envelope underwent inspection. The sense of judicial calm that once defined the building had been replaced by quiet dread. It was there, amid the mounting anxiety, that the third bomb arrived. On December 20th, a clerk sorting mail at the 11th Circuit noticed a parcel unlike the others. The handwriting was blocky, the ink dark, the packaging too tightly wrapped. The box bore a familiar Birmingham postmark, the same city from which the fatal bomb to Judge Vance had been mailed. The clerk hesitated. 2 days earlier, Atlanta had lost one of its own. She alerted security, and the building was evacuated within minutes. Federal marshals sealed off the mailroom, while the ATF and Atlanta Police Bomb Squad moved in. Technicians rolled in a portable X-ray unit and positioned the package inside a containment vessel. The scan revealed a dense metallic cylinder surrounded by wiring. There was no doubt. A third device, identical in construction, had been delivered to the heart of the federal judiciary. The clock on the investigation reset once again. The tension inside every federal building across the South was immediate and relentless. After the deaths of Judge Robert Vance and Attorney Robert Robinson, no one trusted the mail. Secretaries refused to touch new deliveries, clerks wore gloves, and judges signed rulings behind locked chambers. The Christmas season of 1989 had ended in fear. Every brown parcel was now a potential weapon. In Atlanta, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals had become a fortress. The same institution that had once been a forum for constitutional debate now resembled a sealed compound. Armed U.S. Marshals stood guard by the elevators. Bomb-sniffing dogs patrolled hallways. Even the smallest envelope underwent inspection. The sense of judicial calm that once defined the building had been replaced by quiet dread. It was there, amid the mounting anxiety, that the third bomb arrived. On December 20th, a clerk sorting mail at the 11th Circuit noticed a parcel unlike the others. The handwriting was blocky, the ink dark, the packaging too tightly wrapped. The box bore a familiar Birmingham postmark, the same city from which the fatal bomb to Judge Vance had been mailed. The clerk hesitated. 2 days earlier, Atlanta had lost one of its own. She alerted security, and the building was evacuated within minutes. Federal marshals sealed off the mailroom, while the ATF and Atlanta Police Bomb Squad moved in. Technicians rolled in a portable X-ray unit and positioned the package inside a containment vessel. The scan revealed a dense metallic cylinder surrounded by wiring. There was no doubt. A third device, identical in construction, had been delivered to the heart of the federal judiciary. The clock on the investigation reset once again. Hours later, under the controlled precision of bomb technicians, the parcel was carefully opened and rendered safe. Inside lay the complete assembly. A steel pipe, capped at both ends, wired to a switch mechanism, activated by the simple lift of a box lid. The detonator was handcrafted from household items: a battery pack, wires, a section of a pen barrel, and an improvised trigger. The familiarity was haunting. The bomber's design had not changed, not even in detail. The recovery of this live device offered investigators their first full, undamaged example of the killer's craftsmanship. Every joint, every soldered wire, every fold of the cardboard box could be studied. ATF and FBI technicians cataloged the dimensions of the pipe, measured the threading pattern on the caps, and noted the precise type of batteries used. The entire bomb was shipped to the FBI laboratory in Quantico for exhaustive analysis. Forensic experts began dissecting its secrets layer by layer. It was during this process that a fourth package came to light, this time hundreds of miles south in Jacksonville, Florida. Addressed to the local chapter of the NAACP, the parcel was identical in weight and size to the others. Local postal workers, now trained to recognize suspicious characteristics, spotted the similarities. Police were called immediately. Florida bomb specialists, assisted by ATF agents, neutralized the device without injury. Inside, they found the same deadly structure. The nation now knew what investigators had already concluded. Someone had mailed 4 sophisticated bombs across 3 states within a week. 2 had detonated, killing 2 prominent members of the legal community. 2 had been intercepted. Each one bore a deliberate signature, calculated, professional, and deeply personal. In Quantico, the FBI's explosives unit worked around the clock. Their reconstruction lab resembled a surgical theater. White tables lined with the remains of steel pipes, wires, batteries, and brown paper. Using magnification equipment, metallurgists examined tool marks along the threading of the pipes. The burr patterns on the end caps suggested machining from the same worn threading die. That single detail was pivotal. It meant all 4 bombs had been built with identical tools. Meanwhile, the postal inspectors followed the physical trail. They mapped the exact postal route of each package using distribution codes, sorting logs, and barcode imprints. The bomb sent to Judge Vance had passed through Birmingham's Southside Post Office. The Robinson bomb originated in northern Atlanta. The third, mailed to the 11th Circuit, had been dropped at a different Atlanta branch. The fourth, to Jacksonville, bore markings consistent with a postal facility in the same region. The pattern showed deliberate variation. The bomber was moving, mailing from different cities to mask a single point of origin. Agents theorized that the killer drove across state lines, using post offices along major interstates to disperse his trail. He would have known postal routines intimately. When clerks changed shifts, when sorting lines were busiest, when postmarks would blur into thousands of seasonal parcels. It was a plan built on patience, knowledge, and calculation. In Washington, senior officials briefed the Attorney General. The murder of a federal judge was already an extraordinary crime. But the method, mailed bombs across jurisdictions, made it a national emergency. The FBI assigned additional personnel from counterterrorism and behavioral science divisions. They began to construct a psychological profile based on available evidence. The bomber was likely male, middle-aged to older, intelligent, mechanically skilled, and motivated by long-standing resentment, rather than ideology. He was someone who saw himself as wronged by the justice system, and now sought retribution, cloaked in precision. As the forensic teams dug deeper, they began uncovering microscopic clues, invisible to the naked eye. The tape used to seal the boxes contained fingerprints too smudged for identification, but revealed a unique pattern of fibers from cotton gloves. The glue on the address labels carried chemical residues, matching a specific brand of household adhesive, manufactured in the 1970s, long discontinued, but still found in older homes or garages. The typewriter impressions on the labels were traced to a Smith Corona model, produced 2 decades earlier. Every clue pointed backward, toward a man out of time, living in isolation, surrounded by relics from an earlier life. The psychological picture grew sharper. The bomber was nostalgic, deliberate, obsessed with control. His attention to mechanical detail suggested a background in machining or engineering. His ability to produce identical bombs years apart implied experience, perhaps even previous experimentation. The behavioral analyst warned that this was not the bomber's first attempt at weapon design. Somewhere in his past, there would be a prior incident. That warning proved prophetic. Within days, an ATF explosives specialist revisiting old files noticed something strange. A 17-year-old case from Georgia involved a pipe bomb that had exploded prematurely inside a man's home, injuring his wife. The construction details, pipe length, threading style, detonator design, were eerily similar to the Vanpack devices. The man convicted in that 1972 case had served time in federal prison for possession of the bomb, though he insisted on his innocence throughout. His name was Walter Leroy Moody Jr. The technician contacted the Vanpack command post. Agents requested the archived evidence from the 1972 case. When the old photographs and reports arrived, the connection was immediate and unmistakable. The earlier bomb had been nearly identical in form and function. Even the same brand of smokeless powder was used. This discovery redirected the entire investigation. Moody, now in his 50s, had long since been released from prison. Records showed that after his conviction, he had filed numerous appeals, all denied, including petitions to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. His legal filings were obsessive, filled with accusations that the judiciary had conspired against him. The timeline matched perfectly with the Vanpack motive. Moody had lived quietly for years in Rex, Georgia, a suburb outside Atlanta. He maintained a low profile, working odd jobs, writing letters, and harboring a festering hatred for the courts. Surveillance operations were authorized. FBI agents discreetly followed Moody's movements, monitored his mail activity, and obtained samples of his handwriting. The results were alarming. The block letters on the bomb packages were consistent with his style. Hardware store receipts matched the materials used in the bombs. Neighbors described him as withdrawn, but meticulous, often working late nights in his garage with metal tools and soldering equipment. The Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit concluded that Moody had likely rehearsed his revenge for years. He had studied court cases, tracked judges, and constructed a plan designed to inflict maximum symbolic damage. Judge Robert Vance was not chosen at random. Though he had not presided over Moody's original case, he represented the institution that had rejected Moody's appeals. To Moody, the judiciary was a single entity, faceless, powerful, and deserving of punishment. In early January 1990, agents prepared for a search. Court orders were obtained for access to Moody's home and workshop. When executed, the search revealed shelves of metal fittings, tools, and chemical containers. Journals detailed experiments with explosives. Among the papers, agents found drafts of letters addressed to newspapers and civil rights organizations, letters meant to mislead investigators into believing that the bombings were racially motivated. The deception was deliberate, a calculated effort to send the FBI down the wrong path. The forensic match between the Van Pack bombs and Moody's earlier devices was now undeniable. Laboratory tests compared the threading on the recovered pipe fragments to threading marks on pipe seized from Moody's home. The same imperfections appeared. The same chemical residues were present on his tools. Even the handwriting on his notes matched the addresses on the bomb packages. Investigators now understood the scale of his obsession. Moody's hatred for the judiciary was not a fleeting rage, but a lifelong fixation. His 1972 conviction had humiliated him, and every appeal's rejection deepened the wound. Over time, that resentment transformed into a mission of retribution. The bombs were his final argument, delivered through violence rather than law. As January closed, the investigation reached a turning point. Federal prosecutors began assembling the case that would tie all 4 bombs, the intercepted packages, and the 1972 incident together. The Van Pack Task Force's evidence filled entire rooms. Tables covered in photographs, fragments, receipts, and transcripts of surveillance. It was one of the most complex domestic cases the Bureau had ever managed. The intercepted packages had done more than save lives. They had provided the physical and forensic key to unraveling the mystery. Without those intact devices, the bomber's identity might have remained concealed behind ashes and fragments. Instead, they gave investigators a blueprint, a map of his methods, his tools, and ultimately, his mind. The public never saw those details. To most Americans, the case remained a series of headlines. A judge killed, a lawyer murdered, a nation fearful of its own mail. But within the Bureau's walls, agents knew they were facing a man who represented a different kind of threat. One born not of ideology or profit, but of vengeance nurtured in solitude. By the time the new decade began, the task force was ready to move from reaction to pursuit. They had their suspect. They had his pattern. They had proof of continuity stretching back nearly 2 decades. The challenge now was to transform the weight of evidence into an unassailable case, one that could withstand the scrutiny of the very judicial system the killer despised. The intercepted packages had turned the tide. What began as a national panic was becoming a focused operation. The mailed bombs that once carried death now carried the blueprint of their maker's downfall. In the months ahead, as the Bureau's case against Walter Leroy Moody deepened, every line of evidence would converge. From the first explosion in Alabama to the last unopened box in Florida, the path of vengeance that began with a single brown parcel would soon lead back to its architect. And in that pursuit, the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals would confront not only the man responsible, but the question that haunted every investigator: how far can resentment carry a person before it becomes the machinery of terror? The new decade opened under a mood of exhaustion and vigilance. Across the southern field offices of the FBI, every desk was covered with maps, photographs, fragments of metal, and lists of postal routes. The Van Pack Task Force, so named for the killing of Judge Robert Vance, had grown into a coalition of federal precision. Agents from the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the U.S. Marshals Service, the IRS, and state investigators from Alabama, Georgia, and Florida now worked as one. What had begun as a hunt for a single bomber had become a study in patience and method. In Quantico, technicians reconstructed the shattered bombs with the care of archaeologists. Each fragment of pipe was cataloged, weighed, and matched to its twin. Under magnification, metallurgists identified a repeating defect inside the threaded caps, a shallow crescent mark that could only have come from a worn threading die. It was the same flaw on every bomb, a mechanical fingerprint left by the tool that cut the threads. Analysts concluded that all 4 devices had been machined by the same craftsman, likely in a home workshop, using a small bench lathe rather than industrial equipment. Chemical tests confirmed that the explosive charge was Hercules Red Dot smokeless powder, a common reloading compound sold in sporting goods stores across the Southeast. The laboratory's chemists traced the powder to a manufacturing batch distributed through Alabama and Georgia. In the mid-1980s, agents subpoenaed purchase ledgers from gun shops, searching for bulk buyers. Among hundreds of signatures, one name surfaced more than once: Walter Leroy Moody Jr., a man whose file was already being whispered about in the corridors of the task force. While the scientists worked in microscopes, postal inspectors rebuilt the journey of each parcel. Using distribution logs and postmark patterns, they charted how every bomb had traveled through regional sorting centers. The results revealed a methodical hand. The packages had been mailed late in the afternoon, from small suburban branches, where surveillance cameras were rare and holiday traffic was heavy. The sender had used identical handwriting, block capitals written with a felt tip marker, and the same brand of brown tape. Every address label had been typed on an aging manual typewriter. No fingerprints, no hair, no DNA. Whoever mailed them understood how to disappear inside the postal system. A large map in the command room, filled with pins and string, red for confirmed mailing origins, blue for possible secondary points. The red ones formed a narrow corridor, stretching from central Georgia to northern Alabama, a route that could be driven in a few hours. The bomber was operating inside that corridor, mailing from different towns to disguise a single base of movement. At its center sat the small community of Rex, Georgia. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit constructed its first formal profile. The offender was a white male, between 50 and 60, technically skilled, intelligent, and obsessively meticulous. He would have mechanical experience and a record of grievances against authority. His choice of victims, judges and lawyers, reflected resentment toward institutions of justice. The use of false racial targets, such as the NAACP, was an intentional diversion meant to mislead investigators. The analysts described a personality of control, precision, and vindictive patience. Their report ended with a single sentence that defined the months ahead: his enemy is the court itself. Agents turned their attention fully to Walter Leroy Moody Jr., a machinist and self-styled inventor with a past conviction for bomb possession. Surveillance began quietly. Teams rotated outside his modest home in Rex, noting his movements: morning trips to the post office, afternoon drives to hardware stores, long hours alone in his garage workshop. He rarely spoke to neighbors. At night, the light over his workbench burned late, throwing a rectangle of glow across the driveway. Court-authorized audio monitoring was installed. The recordings captured Moody pacing and muttering, rehearsing legal arguments he had made years before. He spoke of corruption, of judges who had betrayed him, of retribution, to investigators listening through static and hum. The pattern of his speech mirrored the language of his written appeals. It was not a confession, but it was motive spoken aloud in solitude. The agencies met each morning in Birmingham for joint briefings. ATF technicians shared metallurgical updates. Postal inspectors reported on routing data. IRS specialists examined Moody's finances for purchases of reloading powder, pipes, and typewriters. Georgia State Police brought in reports of unexplained rural explosions from previous years, some dismissed as hunting accidents, others attributed to fireworks. Agents collected soil and metal samples from those sites. Under microscopy, the fracture lines matched the Van Pack bombs. The same craftsman had been testing designs for years. The psychological portrait of Moody deepened with every discovery. After his 1972 conviction, he had filed appeal after appeal, alleging conspiracies and judicial bias. When the 11th Circuit, the same court where Judge Vance served, denied his petition in 1987, his fury hardened into obsession. He began writing threatening letters to media outlets and civil rights organizations, disguising them as political statements, but echoing his personal grievances. The chronology formed a perfect line, from frustration to retaliation. The bombs were not acts of sudden rage, but the culmination of 17 years of rehearsal. By February 1990, the mosaic of evidence began to take shape. Hardware receipts from a nearby supply store listed purchases of 2-inch steel pipe, threaded caps, and rubber bands. Clerks remembered Moody bringing handwritten lists of dimensions. Laboratory analysis of solder residue from his workshop tools matched that found on bomb fragments. The agencies met each morning in Birmingham for joint briefings. ATF technicians shared metallurgical updates. Postal inspectors reported on routing data. IRS specialists examined Moody's finances for purchases of reloading powder, pipes, and typewriters. Georgia State Police brought in reports of unexplained rural explosions from previous years, some dismissed as hunting accidents, others attributed to fireworks. Agents collected soil and metal samples from those sites. Under microscopy, the fracture lines matched the Van Pack bombs. The same craftsman had been testing designs for years. The psychological portrait of Moody deepened with every discovery. After his 1972 conviction, he had filed appeal after appeal, alleging conspiracies and judicial bias. When the 11th Circuit, the same court where Judge Vance served, denied his petition in 1987, his fury hardened into obsession. He began writing threatening letters to media outlets and civil rights organizations, disguising them as political statements, but echoing his personal grievances. The chronology formed a perfect line from frustration to retaliation. The bombs were not acts of sudden rage, but the culmination of 17 years of rehearsal. By February 1990, the mosaic of evidence began to take shape. Hardware receipts from a nearby supply store listed purchases of 2-inch steel pipe, threaded caps, and rubber bands. Clerks remembered Moody bringing handwritten lists of dimensions. Laboratory analysis of solder residue from his workshop tools matched that found on bomb fragments. His Smith Corona typewriter produced identical impressions to the labels recovered from the bomb packages. Even a roll of Scotch tape on his desk bore the same manufacturing batch code as the tape used on the parcels. Vacuum samples taken from the garage floor yielded microscopic particles of potassium nitrate and lead styphnate. The chemical fingerprints of detonator primers, the cumulative weight of the findings, became undeniable. Every material link led back to one man. Federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Louis Freeh, joined the task force to begin building a case strong enough for a capital indictment. Coordination meetings filled conference rooms from Washington to Atlanta. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred as the departments merged evidence systems, cross-referenced serial numbers, and compiled expert testimony. The death of a federal judge had to be answered with absolute precision. There could be no procedural error. The investigation's visibility grew, but the Bureau maintained secrecy. To the public, the case seemed to stall. Internally, the circle was closing. Moody remained under observation. Agents photographed every envelope he mailed, collected his trash, documented his routes, and logged the mileage of his car. The investigation had shifted from uncertainty to inevitability. In early February, a federal magistrate signed the search warrants. At dawn the next morning, agents converged on Rex. The operation unfolded with quiet discipline: approach, perimeter, entry. Inside the house, they found what they expected: a workshop filled with tools, chemicals, and hardware, identical to that used in the bombs. On the workbench lay a partly assembled pipe with the same dimensions as the van pack devices. Nearby were reloading manuals, electrical guides, and boxes of batteries. In filing cabinets were stacks of letters accusing federal judges of treason and demanding revenge for what he called judicial tyranny. For 2 days, evidence technicians worked through the house and garage. They cataloged each item, photographed it, sealed it in containers, and transported it to Quantico. When the count ended, more than 2,000 pieces of physical evidence had been collected. Among them were unmailed envelopes, addressed to courts and advocacy groups, each containing drafts of statements that sought to blame the bombings on fictitious extremists. The deception strategy was laid bare. Moody was detained for questioning on unrelated firearms charges, while analysis continued. In his notebooks, agents discovered diagrams of pipe assemblies, sketches of detonator circuits, and lists of 11th Circuit judges. Scribbled in one margin was a single sentence: "They destroyed my name, now they pay," which prosecutors later cited as the distilled essence of his motive. Television cameras captured the aftermath of the raid. Crates of evidence carried from a modest house, neighbors staring in disbelief, federal vehicles lining the street. The public saw for the first time the face of the man suspected of killing a judge and an attorney through the mail. He appeared ordinary, expressionless, his demeanor calm. The ordinariness unsettled more than any display of rage could have. In the months that followed, the Bureau's evidence processing became exhaustive. Tool mark comparisons confirmed that the same die had cut every thread on the bomb pipes. Chemical assays matched powder and primer residues between Moody's workshop and the recovered devices. Document examiners demonstrated that his typewriter produced unique key defect patterns identical to those on the parcel labels. The mosaic of proof left little doubt. Grand jury proceedings convened in secret under tight security. Prosecutors outlined 71 counts: murder of a federal official, mailing of explosive devices, obstruction of justice, and intimidation of the judiciary. Expert witnesses were prepared: metallurgists, chemists, postal analysts, handwriting examiners, all trained to explain their findings in clear sequence. The evidence, assembled over months, filled entire evidence lockers. Even as the case advanced toward indictment, the Bureau regarded the Van Pack investigation as more than prosecution. It was a test of institutional endurance. The death of Judge Vance had struck at the symbol of law itself. Every procedural step had to affirm that justice remained deliberate, never reactive. Within FBI training academies, the case began to appear in lectures as an evolving lesson in interagency coordination, forensic precision, and behavioral profiling. Among the agents, fatigue mingled with pride. They had spent months inside windowless rooms, studying metal fragments and postal charts, chasing a mind fueled by grievance. The cost was measured not only in overtime hours, but in the weight of loss. Helen Vance continued her slow recovery, her testimony given in private to prosecutors preparing the courtroom narrative. Her resilience became a reminder of what the investigation represented: that the law, even wounded, must stand. By summer 1990, the evidence was complete. Reports from Quantico, ATF, and the Postal Inspection Service aligned perfectly. The Attorney General authorized capital prosecution. On July 13th, the United States formally indicted Walter Leroy Moody Jr. for the mail bomb murders of Judge Robert Vance and attorney Robert Robinson, and for the attempted bombings of the 11th Circuit and the NAACP. After months of silence, the Bureau's press release was brief and restrained. Behind that restraint lay thousands of hours of reconstruction, thousands of pages of analysis, and the quiet conviction that order had prevailed over vengeance. The investigation had begun with an explosion in a judge's kitchen and ended with a name written in ink on an indictment. Every nail, every pipe, every wire had carried the story of a man who turned resentment into ritual. The Van Pack task force had answered in kind, with patience, precision, and proof. In the corridors of the 11th Circuit, work resumed beneath new layers of security glass. Clerks sorted mail again, cautiously at first, then routinely. The fear that had settled over the judiciary began to lift. Justice, interrupted by violence, continued in silence. The investigation had expanded to its limits, and then concluded, not in vengeance, but in the methodical restoration of law. The investigation had reached a plateau. By early 1990, the Van Pack task force possessed fragments, signatures, patterns, and a map of movement, but not a name that would hold in court. Hundreds of leads had been examined and dismissed. Dozens of suspects had been interviewed, cross-referenced, and cleared. Each new day at the command post began with the same quiet repetition: review, compare, eliminate, begin again. Then, almost by accident, the path backward opened. It began not in Alabama or Atlanta, but in a memory buried 17 years deep. At Quantico, an ATF bomb technician sat studying the recovered wiring from the Atlanta courthouse device. The construction was simple, yet exact. A ballpoint pen tube used to house a firing pin. Wiring coiled neatly. Batteries aligned in perfect symmetry. The design bothered him. It was familiar in a way he could not explain. He had seen this before, not recently, but in an old case file from the early 1970s. A pipe bomb in Georgia, a domestic explosion, not terrorism, yet with the same telltale precision. He left his desk and pulled the microfilm archive. The file he requested came from 1972. It described an explosion inside a home in Macon, Georgia, where a bomb had detonated prematurely, injuring the wife of the man who built it. The design was identical. Same use of pen barrels, same threading pattern, same soldered connections. The man's name on the case report was Walter Leroy Moody Jr. The technician froze over the page. The handwriting of the diagram looked eerily similar to the handwriting on the Van Pack bomb labels. Within hours, copies of the old ATF report were faxed to the Van Pack command center. The team gathered in silence as photographs from 1972 appeared under the projector's light. Close-ups of pipe fragments, a cracked battery casing, a solder joint built by an unsteady but deliberate hand. The resemblance was absolute. The earlier bomb had been recovered after detonating inside Moody's home, the blast injuring his then-wife and leading to his conviction for possession of an unregistered explosive. He had claimed it was an accident, an invention gone wrong. He had served 4 years in federal prison and spent the next decade filing appeals. The agents read deeper into the file. After his release, Moody had reinvented himself as a self-taught machinist, an inventor. He had petitioned the courts repeatedly to overturn his conviction, accusing judges and prosecutors of conspiring against him. His final appeal had reached the 11th Circuit in the late 1980s, the same court where Judge Robert Vance had served. When that appeal was denied, he had written letters to newspapers warning that the judicial system would reap what it had sown. The words carried the same cold precision as his machines. The connection changed everything. The Van Pack task force, which had been chasing a faceless bomber across 3 states, suddenly had a historical anchor. The name from the past explained the present. The bomb design was not new. It was an evolution of a design Moody had already tested. The hatred of the courts was not random. It was personal, sharpened over 17 years of failure. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit refined its psychological profile accordingly. The offender was not a young radical or a political extremist. He was an aging man obsessed with reclaiming dignity through control. Every bomb he built was a restoration of power he believed the courts had taken from him. Investigators moved quickly to confirm the link through physical evidence. The ATF's archives still held fragments from the 1972 bomb. When compared under a microscope to the metal pieces from the Van Pack devices, the match was uncanny. The pipes had been cut with tools producing identical striation marks, minute, parallel grooves, left by a worn steel die. Even the solder composition was the same, a specific blend of tin and lead, sold under a discontinued brand. The conclusion was unavoidable. The hand that built the 1972 bomb had built the 1989 bombs. Agents began building a life timeline for Moody. Born in Georgia in 1935, he had left high school early, enlisted briefly in the Army, then spent years working odd jobs: machinist, welder, mechanic. He was intelligent but solitary, a man who preferred machines to people. In 1966, he had married, though by the early 1970s, the marriage was collapsing. His fascination with explosives began around that time, couched in the language of experimentation. The 1972 explosion that injured his wife had ended both his freedom and his marriage. Prison had deepened his resentment. Every appeal he lost fed the belief that he was a victim of judicial corruption. When he was released in 1976, Moody retreated into isolation. He remarried years later and moved to Rex, Georgia, a quiet suburb southeast of Atlanta. To his neighbors he was polite, but distant. To himself he was the central character in a private war against injustice. In his garage he built small mechanical inventions, wrote letters to Congress, and filed endless petitions to federal courts. Each rejection reinforced his conviction that the legal system was beyond redemption. The 11th Circuit's final dismissal, in 1987, had marked, for him, the closing of lawful recourse. It was the moment he turned to vengeance. As the task force pieced together his history, the threads of the case tightened. The hardware stores where Moody bought materials for his experiments matched the same stores identified through purchase records for pipes and powder used in the bombs. Surveillance confirmed his daily routines: morning trips to the post office, hours spent in the garage, in frequent contact with others. Investigators noted that his garage contained a small bench lathe, the exact type of tool that could have created the thread marks found on the bomb caps. Court-authorized audio surveillance revealed another layer. Moody often spoke aloud when alone, narrating grievances, recalling the judges who had denied him. In one recording, he rehearsed an argument about how the courts had ruined his reputation. He mentioned the 11th Circuit by name. Though not a confession, these monologues betrayed fixation. To the agents listening, it sounded like a man trying to convince himself that revenge was reason. The Bureau now had both history and motive, but what emerged next was more disturbing. Among Moody's seized writings were early drafts of letters designed to frame others for the bombings. One accused fictitious white supremacists of plotting to kill civil rights figures. Another implied that black extremists sought vengeance against the judiciary. Both were carefully worded to align with the racial tension narratives that had initially misled investigators. He had engineered not only the bombs but the investigation itself, counting on the FBI to chase social motives rather than personal ones. His intelligence had always been his camouflage. Forensic progress mirrored psychological insight. The FBI laboratory performed metallurgical analysis on the seized components from Moody's home. The lead styphnate traces on his workbench matched those on the bomb triggers. Residue inside his reloading equipment contained particles identical to those found in the van pack explosives. Even the handwriting on his address book corresponded to the precise spacing and stroke weight of the bomb labels. Piece by piece, the wall of evidence grew higher. By spring 1990, the connection between the past and the present had been fully established. Walter Leroy Moody had not emerged from nowhere. He was a man built from the debris of his own failure. His methods learned through decades of self-taught craft. Each bomb was an echo of the first one that had destroyed his home in 1972. The cycle had come full circle. Only now the casualties were not accidental. Investigators revisited the 1972 court transcripts for deeper context. There, buried in the old testimony, were details that now seemed prophetic. Even then, Moody had displayed contempt for the judicial process, arguing that the government had framed him, that judges were incompetent. The same phrases reappeared almost word for word in letters recovered from his recent files. He had been repeating his own defense for 17 years, rewriting it until it became justification for murder. The psychological portrait solidified into something chilling. Moody's resentment had evolved beyond anger into a philosophy. In his mind, the judiciary represented an oppressive machine, and he alone was its victim, an avenger. He wrote of justice as a personal act, not a societal principle. The precision of his bombs, the targeting of specific victims, the attempt to frame others, all expressed a mind consumed by self-righteous grievance. Investigators began to describe him as a domestic terrorist, whose ideology was himself. The task force now faced the delicate stage of transformation from investigation to prosecution. Every link between the 1972 and 1989 cases had to survive legal scrutiny. Prosecutors demanded documentation for each forensic comparison, each psychological inference. They wanted to ensure that Moody's past could be introduced as relevant evidence, rather than prejudicial history. It was a balancing act between science and law. Agents in the field continued to monitor him closely. Although he was under investigation, he still lived at home, unaware of the full extent of the evidence. Teams rotated surveillance vehicles through nearby streets to avoid detection. Every envelope he mailed was photographed. Before leaving the postal system, he spent his days tinkering in his workshop, writing letters, and occasionally driving to rural areas, where he conducted what appeared to be small tests with chemicals. None of these acts were overtly criminal, but all confirmed the profile of a man preparing for a stage on which he believed himself both performer and judge. In March, forensic analysts achieved one of the investigation's most decisive breakthroughs, comparing the pipes seized from Moody's residence with the fragments from the Van Pack bombs. They discovered microscopic tool marks, identical in alignment and spacing. These were not merely similar. They were specific to the wear pattern of a single die. The probability of coincidence was mathematically negligible. The same machine had cut all of them. It was the technical equivalent of a fingerprint. From that moment, the investigation ceased to be speculative. The prosecutors now had the full chronology. In 1972, Moody's first bomb had destroyed his home and his marriage. In 1975, he had been released from prison, vowing to clear his name. In 1987, after his final appeal failed at the 11th Circuit, he had shifted from victim to avenger. In 1989, he built and mailed 4 bombs, 2 detonated, 2 defused. Every step between those years was now documented in letters, receipts, and forensic data. His life was an unbroken chain of grievance, leading to a single point of detonation. As the case prepared to move into the arrest phase, agents reflected on how a forgotten file from a bygone decade had unlocked the mystery. Without the ATF technician's memory, the Van Pack investigation might have drifted indefinitely through false leads. Instead, a name written on yellowing paper had become the key to unraveling one of the most complex bombing cases in American history. By late spring 1990, the decision was made. The Bureau would proceed toward indictment. Surveillance teams were reinforced, and the U.S. Attorney's Office began drafting preliminary charges. On the desks inside the Birmingham command post, the photographs of the 1972 explosion now sat beside those of Judge Vance's destroyed kitchen. 2 eras of violence, 1 signature, 1 man. The name from the past had returned to the present, and with it came the full shape of the tragedy. Walter Leroy Moody's story was no longer the curiosity of an old case file. It was the through line connecting decades of resentment, craftsmanship, and calculated revenge. What began as a small explosion in a Georgia home had evolved into the assassination of a federal judge and an attack on the foundation of justice itself. The investigation had reached its turning point. What remained was the confrontation, law against the man who believed himself above it. The next chapter would unfold not in laboratories or field offices, but in the courtroom, where the system he despised would render its final judgment. The name was no longer a rumor. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. now sat at the center of every chart and timeline. Inside the Van Pack command post, his history bridged 2 decades of explosions. His habits, meticulous, mechanical, and solitary, fit every inch of the emerging profile. But proof required patience. No confession existed. No eyewitness. No direct trace of the moment he mailed the packages. The Bureau had to construct its case from fragments, chemistry, and movement. 2 fronts evolved in parallel: the quiet precision of the laboratories and the restless vigilance of the field teams, shadowing his life. At Quantico, the forensic rooms had taken on the stillness of a surgical ward. On long stainless tables lay the components seized from Moody's home: steel pipes, rolls of tape, boxes of nails, coils of wire, and containers of powder labeled in his handwriting. Technicians compared every fragment to the remnants of the bombs that had killed Judge Vance and Attorney Robinson. Microscopic analysis revealed that the end cap threads from his garage matched the same worn die signature found on the Van Pack devices. The soldering patterns were identical, neat joints made by a craftsman who had repeated the process dozens of times. Even the scratches along the inside of each pipe aligned with the tool marks from the bombs that had detonated months earlier. Each detail stitched the 2 crime scenes together until they became one continuous act. Chemical analysts examined traces from the reloading bench. Among the dust and shavings, they found particles of Hercules red dot, smokeless powder, lead stephanate, and potassium nitrate, the exact composition used in the mail bombs. When those results were presented to the task force, the room fell silent. The pattern of proof was beginning to solidify beyond interpretation. Yet outside the laboratories, Moody remained free, moving through his routines with the same mechanical calm that had defined his life. Surveillance teams operated in shifts from unmarked sedans parked along the narrow streets of Rex, Georgia. Agents watched him collect his mail, drive to hardware stores, and visit small gun supply shops. He spoke to no one for long. When he left home, he carried notebooks, lists, and envelopes. One team followed him north toward Birmingham. Another tracked his return through the rural back roads. They documented every mile. The investigators noted that his routes often passed near post offices used for the mailings. He seemed unaware of the eyes following him. Or perhaps he assumed he remained invisible, as he always had. Back in Quantico, the FBI laboratory performed a rare comparison: metallurgical fingerprints between the 1972 bomb fragments, the 1989 devices, and the pipes recovered from Moody's workshop. Using scanning electron microscopy, Analysts mapped the crystalline structure of the steel and discovered a consistent manufacturing impurity, traces of manganese, within a narrow tolerance band unique to one supplier. All samples pointed to the same production lot, suggesting that Moody had hoarded pipe stock for years, reusing it from the same batch. The continuity was microscopic, but unmistakable. Time had not changed his materials, only his targets. While scientists measured atoms, agents listened. The audio surveillance continued, capturing hours of Moody's voice, muttering across static. He rehearsed grievances, spoke the names of judges, recounted his failed appeals, and described himself as a man denied justice. He often walked the length of his garage while speaking, the faint metallic clang of tools echoing in the background. Each recording was cataloged and transcribed. Psychologists described the tone as ritualistic, self-justification, evolving into confession through repetition. In late February, surveillance teams observed Moody traveling west toward Alabama. He visited gas stations, small motels, and hardware stores along the interstate, paying in cash, keeping receipts. Agents collected the discarded slips from trash bins, adding them to the growing lattice of evidence. Each receipt became a marker on the timeline: where he drove, what he bought, when he stopped. The route mirrored the corridor through which the bombs had once moved. By tracing his ordinary errands, the Bureau was reconstructing his crimes in reverse. At the ATF Explosive Center, technicians conducted controlled test detonations, using reconstructed versions of Moody's devices. The purpose was not spectacle, but measurement. Each blast generated a pattern identical to the original crime scenes: fragmentation angles, pressure signatures, and residue fields. From those tests, investigators could calculate the precise distance the bomber must have cut the fuse wire, and the strength of his sealing epoxy. It was evidence expressed in mathematics, a language the courts would understand. When the results arrived at headquarters, they were folded neatly into the chain of custody, another strand of precision, binding the case together. Moody's behavior began to change. Surveillance noted an increase in agitation. He double-checked his mailbox before touching it, altered his driving routes, and occasionally parked in random lots to sit motionless for long stretches. It was as though some internal alarm had begun to sound. He wrote more letters, angrier, longer, scattered with accusations. One, intercepted through judicial channels, repeated his mantra that the courts were corrupt and deserved destruction. Investigators saw it as both warning and confirmation. The pressure of the pursuit was reaching him. In Birmingham, prosecutors convened the evidence team for review sessions. Every artifact seized from Moody's home was examined in sequence: the pipe stock, the typewriter, the chemicals, the notebooks. On one page, agents found a sketch diagram labeled "Timer Concept, 90 seconds delay." Although the Van Pack bombs had used no delay mechanism, the drawing showed continued experimentation. He was refining his craft long after the murders. The discovery underscored how close he might have come to striking again if the investigation had faltered. Parallel to the physical reconstruction ran the human timeline. Agents traced Moody's correspondences from the 1980s, gathering copies of every letter he had mailed to judges, newspapers, and civil rights organizations. The language oscillated between legal argument and veiled threat. Phrases from those letters reappeared verbatim in drafts found in his home, establishing continuity of authorship. To the Bureau, it was the written equivalent of fingerprints. The man who wrote of judicial tyranny in 1985 had become the bomber who delivered his sentence by mail in 1989. Through spring, the field teams documented the gradual contraction of Moody's world. He spoke less to neighbors, walked the perimeter of his property at night, and kept his blinds closed. He seemed both defiant and afraid, sensing pursuit without seeing it. Agents compared notes daily, careful not to provoke him into violence. They knew that a man who had once killed through parcels could just as easily choose a more direct confrontation. Every movement of the surveillance units balanced caution with proximity. Meanwhile, the laboratory's document examiners finalized their comparisons between the address labels and the typewritten pages seized from Moody's files. Under spectral lighting, the tiny defects in each letter E matched perfectly, the product of a chipped type bar, unique to his Smith Corona machine. It was a definitive identification. In court, it would be as conclusive as a fingerprint. The typewriter itself became a silent witness, its worn keys preserving the mechanical echo of his crimes. By May 1990, the Bureau's internal chronology of the case spanned an entire wall of the Birmingham Command Center. On the far left, photographs from the 1972 explosion. In the center, the 4 bombs of 1989, each plotted with location, postmark, and forensic notes. On the right, a grid of receipts, letters, and lab reports connecting everything back to Moody's garage. The lines between them formed a web of causality that no defense could untangle. Every item pointed to intent, not accident. The prosecutors began rehearsing their theory of motive. They would show that Moody's 1972 conviction had been the seed of revenge, that the 11th Circuit's 1987 rejection of his appeal had been the final spark, and that his mail bomb campaign had been a calculated attempt to punish those he blamed for his humiliation. The intercepted bombs to the NAACP and the 11th Circuit were, in this theory, diversions. An effort to disguise personal vengeance as ideological conflict. In the quiet of the command room, that logic settled over the team like gravity. It explained everything. Field surveillance tightened as prosecutors prepared for arrest. Agents followed Moody on a trip into downtown Atlanta, where he entered a public library and spent hours reading law journals. He photocopied articles about federal appeals and capital cases. Later, at a payphone, he placed several calls traced to newspaper offices and advocacy groups. The Bureau intercepted none of them, but the pattern suggested he was laying groundwork for future manipulations, perhaps letters of protest, perhaps another attempt at misdirection. He remained convinced that he could control the narrative. In early summer, forensic results arrived from the handwriting experts. The spacing, slant, and pen pressure of the bomb labels matched the samples taken from Moody's legal correspondence with statistical certainty. The signature characteristic was an exaggerated tail on the letter Y. It appeared on every piece of writing he had ever produced, including the earliest petitions from the 1970s. The analysts concluded that the labels were his. Beyond doubt, it was the final bridge between psychology and physical evidence. By June, the pattern of pursuit began to compress. Moody drove less, slept less, and appeared increasingly suspicious. Agents reported him glancing at passing cars, lingering near windows, and occasionally disassembling equipment in his garage, only to reassemble it hours later. He was dismantling his own life, as though erasing traces he could feel but not see. The Bureau knew the window was closing. Any delay risked new violence or destruction of evidence. In the second week of July, prosecutors gathered to finalize the indictment. The evidence file exceeded 10,000 pages. Every test result, every photograph, every surveillance log was indexed and numbered. When the Attorney General authorized the charges, the task force prepared for the final phase, arrest. Agents reviewed entry procedures, containment plans, and transport routes. They rehearsed in silence, knowing that precision was both habit and necessity. At dawn on July 13, 1990, federal teams surrounded Moody's residence. There were no shouts, no chaos, only the measured sequence of command. He was taken into custody without resistance, his face expressionless. Inside the garage, the light still burned above the workbench, illuminating the tools that had carried his hatred from metal to murder. The long pursuit was over, but the reckoning was only beginning. In the hours after the arrest, the agents who had followed him for months stood outside the small house, watching evidence technicians remove the crates of material. The quiet suburb returned to its ordinary rhythm, children walking to school, commuters driving past, unaware that the man next door had waged a private war against the nation's courts. The case would now move from streets and laboratories to the courtroom, where science would speak louder than vengeance. Inside headquarters, the Van Pack command board was cleared. The photographs packed away for trial. What remained was a sense of measured relief. The investigation that had stretched from a judge's kitchen in Alabama to a suburban garage in Georgia had come full circle. For the Bureau, it was the affirmation that persistence could still overcome secrecy. That method could still dismantle madness. The evidence had been traced, the man captured, and the machinery of justice prepared to turn once more. The balance between field and laboratory, intuition and analysis, had closed a case that might easily have remained a riddle. What began with 4 bombs ended with one man's life, under the microscope of the law. The operation no longer resembled an investigation. It had become a siege. Every movement Walter Leroy Moody made was documented. Every phone call logged. Every conversation transcribed. Agents no longer wondered if he was guilty. Their task was to ensure the evidence chain remained unbroken. What had started as pursuit now demanded preservation. The Bureau could not afford a single procedural flaw. The case that began with an explosion in December 1989 was approaching the point where science, surveillance, and prosecution would converge. Moody's life had become the theater of federal precision. He woke early, often before dawn, and moved through his home with mechanical order. Agents recorded the timing of his curtains, the ignition of his car, the duration of each errand. He visited grocery stores, banks, and post offices. Each stop was mapped, time-stamped, and photographed from multiple angles. When he met his wife for errands or meals, agents noted the number of words exchanged and whether any envelope changed hands. The routine was suffocatingly ordinary, and that was its own kind of tension. The man who had once weaponized the postal system now appeared to live inside its rhythm. Behind this facade of normalcy, Moody's behavior had begun to shift. The calm precision of his days grew erratic. He started taking detours for no reason, stopping abruptly on side roads, turning back on himself. He stood for minutes at mailboxes, without mailing anything, then drove away. Agents recognized the pattern, awareness of surveillance, but without proof. He could feel pressure closing in, but not the direction it came from. He grew thinner, his walks longer, his letters darker. In one intercepted draft, he accused the agents of tyranny, of watching him even inside his mind. To the Bureau, it was confirmation of a psychological unraveling. To him, it was war. While field teams tracked Moody's movements, the laboratories continued their silent work. Quantico's document analysis unit was finalizing the full reconstruction of the bomb labels and mailing materials. The adhesive used on the address tags had been traced to a discontinued brand of glue manufactured in the 1970s, identical to that found in Moody's garage. The brown wrapping paper matched a stock distributed to only a handful of stationery suppliers. When cross-referenced with purchase records from hardware stores he frequented, the match closed another gap. Nothing about the case was left to inference. Every conclusion required an artifact. The ATF conducted further test blasts, using the reconstructed devices. Each test confirmed the consistency of Moody's designs. The explosion at Judge Vance's home, when modeled in simulation, produced identical fragmentation patterns to the one that had killed Attorney Robinson in Atlanta. The pressure readings were the same. Even the orientation of the battery pack and switch were consistent. The bombs had not been random acts of improvisation. They were engineered replications of a perfected formula. Forensic analysts began to call the design Moody's signature. In Birmingham, prosecutors prepared their strategy with almost military discipline. Assistant U.S. Attorney Louis Free organized evidence exhibits into a sequence designed to tell the story, without emotion, only facts and continuity. Photographs of bomb fragments, metallurgical reports, and purchase receipts were ordered chronologically to demonstrate a deliberate progression from grievance to action. The goal was not merely conviction, but clarity. The Justice Department intended the trial to stand as a reaffirmation that the law could dissect and dismantle its attackers with logic alone. The coordination extended beyond evidence. U.S. Marshals developed security plans for the transportation of Moody, the protection of witnesses, and the safety of judges assigned to the trial. Every courthouse that had once been a potential target now stood under enhanced protection. Entry points were screened by magnetometers. Mail was x-rayed, and bomb dogs swept corridors each morning. For the judiciary, the case was not just legal, it was existential. It tested whether a system that prided itself on openness could defend itself against targeted fear. Moody was now living under constant shadow. When he drove into Atlanta, unmarked cars followed at staggered intervals. When he walked his dog, agents recorded his pacing and body language. When he mailed letters, postal inspectors intercepted them. The pressure was invisible but absolute. Some days he attempted to test his watchers by driving erratically through back roads, but the Bureau had refined its choreography. He was never lost, only circled. His home became the focal point of observation. Hidden microphones captured the sound of metal tools scraping against one another, drawers opening, papers shuffling. He rarely spoke aloud anymore. Instead, he wrote pages and pages of tightly typed documents, denouncing judges, prosecutors, and traitors to justice. His words revealed not remorse, but logic twisted into inevitability. He saw himself as an instrument of correction, not a murderer. For agents reading the transcripts, it was clear he was losing distinction between ideology and delusion. Meanwhile, investigators returned to the early 1970s case to extract its final evidentiary value. They tracked down original witnesses, including law enforcement officials, who had handled the first bomb that injured his wife. One remembered the same mechanical precision in Moody's home workshop, the same stacks of pipe and wires. Another recalled his obsession with reclaiming his reputation after conviction. Their testimonies would later frame his motive as a continuum, stretching from accident to intent. The past, once forgotten, had become the prosecution's most valuable witness. In late 1990, as preparations for trial intensified, Moody's awareness of being hunted turned into resentment. He wrote letters under false names to newspapers, accusing the government of corruption and cover-ups. Some he mailed, others he kept hidden in drawers. He drafted manifestos, describing himself as a victim of judicial tyranny. Agents recovered them during later searches and added them to the mountain of evidence. Each letter deepened the same theme: self-persecution reimagined as righteousness. To the Bureau, his delusions had become his defense. The Van Pack Task Force now functioned as an unbroken chain of evidence. Custodians, every fragment, photograph, and transcript was secured under double lock. Court orders ensured that the integrity of the chain of custody would not be challenged. When Free reviewed the assembled record, he saw a structure built on redundancy. Every conclusion had at least 3 points of corroboration. The team's discipline mirrored Moody's own obsession with precision, but their purpose was its opposite: order instead of chaos. As the year turned, the psychological warfare between Moody and his watchers intensified. He began recording his own observations of the neighborhood, writing license plate numbers of cars he did not recognize. He told acquaintances that he was being framed by the FBI. His paranoia was both defense mechanism and evidence of guilt. He had built a machine of vengeance, and now he lived inside its logic, unable to distinguish surveillance from consequence. Agents maintained distance, careful not to provoke confrontation. The Bureau's internal directives emphasized patience. Above all else, the goal was not to trap him in panic, but to watch him collapse under the quiet weight of inevitability. In January 1991, Moody was transferred into formal federal custody as prosecutors prepared the indictment on more than 70 charges. The courtroom in Birmingham was fortified for the proceedings. Bullet-resistant glass, controlled access, restricted press. The trial was expected to last months. For investigators who had lived inside the case for over a year, the transition from fieldwork to legal battle was disorienting. The noise of surveillance gave way to the silence of paperwork. The fight moved from the streets to the benches of justice. Throughout the pre-trial months, the evidence unfolded in methodical sequence. Expert witnesses described the bomb construction. Forensic analysts detailed the chemical matches. Postal inspectors mapped the mailing routes, and psychologists outlined Moody's obsession with the judiciary. The defense tried to argue circumstantial coincidence, but each point was answered by layers of data. The typewriter, the pipes, the glue, the handwriting, all spoke louder than theory. The courtroom became a forensic mosaic of cause and consequence. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered daily, chronicling the rare spectacle of a man accused of assassinating a federal judge. For the public, it was a case that tested the limits of domestic justice. For the agents who had lived it, it was the final act of a pursuit that had consumed 2 years of their lives. They watched from the gallery as evidence boxes, each marked Van Pack, were carried into the courtroom, one after another. Every box contained not only proof, but history. Moody maintained his composure throughout, sitting upright, taking notes and occasionally correcting his attorneys on procedural details. His detachment was unnerving. To observers, he seemed less like a defendant than a man attending the trial of someone else. Yet as each exhibit was introduced, the walls of his narrative closed tighter. The evidence was not emotional. It was mechanical, empirical, relentless. The same traits that had once made him meticulous now left him trapped by his own consistency. By mid-1991, the defense strategy had withered under the weight of accumulation. The jury heard the final sequence of forensic testimony: the metallurgical match, the chemical residue, the typewriter keys, the adhesive compound, and the handwriting comparison. Each witness reaffirmed what the others had proven. There was no single moment of revelation, only the slow, relentless layering of proof until doubt itself seemed absurd. On June 28, 1991, after weeks of deliberation, the verdict was delivered: guilty on all counts, over 70 federal charges, including the murder of Judge Robert Vance and the mail bombing of attorney Robert Robinson. The sentence: life imprisonment without parole. The case that had begun with terror ended in paperwork, the most deliberate victory the Bureau could offer. Justice had not been swift, but it had been exact. In the aftermath, agents stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the verdict settling over them like exhaustion. The mission that had consumed years had reached its legal end. Though its psychological residue lingered, the surveillance had ended, but the habit of vigilance remained. For the FBI, the Van Pack case became both closure and doctrine, a lesson in the persistence required to dismantle a mind built on vengeance. Walter Leroy Moody was transferred under heavy guard to federal custody, beginning a sentence that would last the rest of his life. He remained defiant, filing motions, writing letters, arguing the same points that had consumed him for decades. But outside his cell, the nation moved on. Judges continued their work, clerks handled mail again, and the fear that had once gripped the judiciary began to fade into history. The surveillance had tightened until it became history itself. What the Bureau left behind was not triumph but record. Thousands of pages chronicling how obsession turns to destruction, and how method, patience, and law reclaim control from chaos. The silence that followed was the only sound left of a pursuit that had once echoed across the South. The case had begun in fire and ended in order. The federal courthouse in Birmingham stood behind reinforced glass and newly installed metal detectors. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and polished steel. Each morning, marshals swept the building with dogs before the doors opened. The bombing of a federal judge had transformed ordinary architecture into a symbol of endurance. The trial of Walter Leroy Moody Jr. would be the test of whether that endurance could withstand precision scrutiny from every side of the law. Proceedings began in early 1991. Less than 18 months after the killing of Judge Robert Vance, the courtroom itself had been altered for the occasion. Heavy ballistic panels framed the benches. Evidence screens were fitted to display enlarged photographs of fragments, wires, and pipe sections. Each evidence box was labeled with the black stenciled code, Van Pack. Rows of federal prosecutors filled the right side of the room. The defense sat opposite, flanked by stacks of legal binders. At the center, Moody appeared calm and deliberate, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, his hair combed neatly back. To onlookers, he resembled an academic rather than a murderer. The prosecution's strategy was architectural. Each layer of evidence built directly upon the one before it. Assistant U.S. Attorney Louis Freeh opened the case with a precise framework: 4 bombs, 2 detonated, 2 intercepted, all built from identical materials, all mailed through a pattern that mirrored Moody's travel routes. The first objective was foundation. Jurors had to understand how an ordinary parcel could become a weapon of mechanical certainty. Expert witnesses from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms took the stand first. Using charts and diagrams, they described the internal construction of the bombs. Photographs displayed cross-sections of pipes, switch mechanisms, and solder joints. The experts explained how the devices were triggered by the lifting of a box lid, demonstrating that each component required careful machining. Their testimony established that the bombs had been made by someone with mechanical aptitude, patience, and access to a workshop. The phrase "identical design lineage" appeared repeatedly in their reports. When asked whether such uniformity could occur by coincidence, each witness answered with the same measured certainty. Next came the metallurgists from the FBI laboratory. They presented comparative micrographs of the pipe threads, enlarged until the grooves looked like topographical maps. Point by point, they explained how the burr patterns matched those produced by the threading die seized from Moody's garage. The prosecution introduced a sample pipe recovered during the search, its dimensions identical to those from the exploded devices. Each technical match tightened the chain, linking Moody's home to the crimes. Document examiners followed. They displayed enlarged images of typewritten labels from the bomb packages, alongside documents typed on Moody's Smith Corona machine. Jurors saw the identical flaw in the letter E, caused by a chipped type bar. Under spectral illumination, the chemical composition of the ribbon ink was shown to be the same brand, same batch. The handwriting analysis came next. Charts illustrated Moody's distinctive right slanting block letters. Analysts explained the pen pressure and stroke variation. Their conclusion was clinical. The same person who addressed the bomb packages had written Moody's personal correspondence. Each piece of forensic evidence was presented as a separate pillar, but together, they formed an architecture of guilt. The postal inspectors provided the geographic framework. Using maps, they traced the route of each bomb through the postal system, showing the points of origin in Birmingham and Atlanta, and the sequence of distribution centers they passed through. The inspectors then overlaid those routes on Moody's documented travel patterns from credit card receipts and surveillance logs. The match was undeniable. Each mailing location corresponded to a place Moody had visited within a 24-hour window. The prosecution called it a geography of intention. After the forensic and logistical testimony, prosecutors turned to motive. They introduced court records from the 1972 conviction that had first brought Moody into the justice system. Jurors were shown excerpts from his appeals, including the 1987 11th Circuit decision, denying his motion to overturn that conviction. The sequence illustrated a man consumed by resentment toward the courts, culminating in direct correspondence to judges accusing them of corruption and betrayal. The connection to Judge Vance's court was plain. To Moody, the 11th Circuit was the symbol of every rejection he had endured. The psychological experts were careful not to dramatize. Their testimony focused on patterns of obsession, control, and grievance. They described Moody as an intelligent but rigid personality, someone who equated legal defeat with personal annihilation. His writings demonstrated classic characteristics of narcissistic resentment: inability to accept fault, externalization of blame, and transformation of perceived injustice into moral crusade. The experts did not speak of madness. They spoke of method. Each day of testimony followed the same cadence: presentation, authentication, cross-examination. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of forensic science, suggesting contamination or misinterpretation. But every attempt was met with layers of documentation. Chain of custody logs were produced, signed by agents and technicians, showing uninterrupted control from collection to courtroom. The FBI's internal discipline became part of the narrative. Order as defense against doubt. When the prosecution displayed photographs from Judge Vance's home, the shattered kitchen, the cratered floor, the remnants of the box, no adjectives were offered. The images spoke through absence. Jurors saw not spectacle, but consequence. The contrast between Moody's technical precision and the human destruction it caused gave the case its moral weight. There was no need for rhetoric. Over the following weeks, more than 100 witnesses took the stand, postal workers, hardware store clerks, metallurgists, handwriting experts, and investigators. Each added a fragment to the mosaic. The defense worked to suggest alternative suspects or errors in interpretation. But the pattern of corroboration left no space for ambiguity. Even the brand of tape used to seal the packages matched a partial roll found in Moody's home. The statistical probability of coincidence had collapsed. Courtroom security remained intense throughout. Mail entering the courthouse was x-rayed daily. Jurors were escorted under guard between hotel and courtroom. The proceedings were recorded in detail by court reporters working in shifts. The nation followed the case through daily updates, each headline carrying the same refrain: the machinery of justice on trial for its own survival. As weeks turned to months, the courtroom atmosphere became one of clinical inevitability. The prosecution had built its case like engineers, not orators. They presented no grand emotional appeals, only precision. Their final summation emphasized process. Every scientific discipline represented, every finding independently verified, every conclusion supported by data. They reminded the jury that the same system Moody had sought to destroy was now judging him through rules he had rejected yet depended upon for fairness. The defense's closing arguments leaned on doubt. They claimed that circumstantial evidence had been mistaken for certainty, that technical matches did not equal intent. They portrayed Moody as a victim of coincidence, a man crushed by an apparatus too vast to fight. But their words carried little momentum. The evidence, accumulated layer by layer, had become immovable. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom remained still. Agents and analysts, who had worked the case for over a year, sat together in the gallery, their silence heavier than fatigue. They understood that the outcome, whatever it was, would define years of labor. The wait lasted less than a day. The jurors returned, composed and solemn, delivering their verdict without flourish. Guilty on all counts. More than 70 charges sustained: murder of a federal judge, mailing of explosives, obstruction of justice, and intimidation of the judiciary. The words echoed with procedural calm. Moody showed no visible reaction. He adjusted his glasses, wrote something in his notebook, and stared ahead. The marshals stood behind him, expressionless. It was the conclusion of the most complex domestic bombing investigation in federal history. Sentencing followed with equal restraint. The prosecution sought life imprisonment, citing the deliberate nature of the crimes and the absence of remorse. The court concurred. The judge described the crimes as an assault on the rule of law itself. Moody was remanded to federal custody to serve life without parole. The Bureau's agents filed their reports, sealed the evidence, and dismantled the command post that had become their second home. The Van Pack investigation had passed from action into record. Outside the courthouse, cameras recorded the departure of vehicles as the public tried to make sense of a case defined by calculation rather than passion. For the judiciary, the verdict was less vengeance than equilibrium restored. The system had endured the test of its own vulnerability and emerged intact. For the FBI and ATF, it was the culmination of coordination, so exact that it became the template for future joint investigations. Every protocol developed during Van Pack, chain of custody, interagency evidence exchange, behavioral synthesis, would later be codified into federal investigative doctrine. Within weeks, the trial transcripts were archived, the evidence boxes stored in climate-controlled vaults, and the agents reassigned. The name Walter Leroy Moody became a case file reference, a cautionary example of what meticulous hatred could build and what relentless order could dismantle. Years later, when he was transferred to Alabama for state trial and eventual execution, the federal record remained the blueprint that ensured every later conviction would stand without appeal. The Van Pack trial became a benchmark, not because of spectacle, but because of its restraint. The prosecution had shown that justice, when stripped of emotion, could still possess weight. It was a demonstration that the same tools of procedure, documentation, verification, evidence, could dismantle a crime constructed with similar precision. The symmetry was complete. By the time the courthouse emptied and the security barriers were removed, the nation had already turned its attention elsewhere. But in legal circles, the case remained a quiet legend. The moment the judicial system proved it could withstand an attack from one of its own former petitioners. For the agents and prosecutors who had lived through it, the conclusion was neither triumph nor closure, only the steady reaffirmation of law's endurance over time. When the final sentencing documents were signed, the Van Pack case officially closed at the federal level. The record stood as a monument of process. Every nail, every pipe, every document cataloged in duplicate. What remained was history. A reminder that the machinery of justice, though slow, could be as exacting as the bombs built to destroy it. When the federal proceedings concluded, in 1991, the Van Pack case was considered legally resolved, but not historically complete. The Bureau had proven its point. Method could defeat vengeance, but the crime that had shaken the judiciary remained. In the eyes of the state of Alabama, an offense committed on its soil. The murder of Judge Robert Smith Vance, a citizen of Alabama, and a member of its own judicial community, warranted a separate reckoning. Within weeks of the federal sentencing, the Attorney General's office began coordinating with Jefferson County prosecutors to prepare state charges. The goal was not duplication, but finality. Walter Leroy Moody remained in federal custody at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Even from prison, his precision persisted. He filed motions, letters, and requests to inspect evidence. Each was handwritten in the same neat slanted script. Each repeated the same argument, that he was the victim of corruption, that the government had silenced him. The courts denied every motion. The record of the Van Pack trial had been built to withstand exactly such assaults. Alabama prosecutors spent the next several years assembling a parallel case under state jurisdiction. The state's indictment, filed in 1991, charged Moody with capital murder for killing a sitting judge through the use of a mailed explosive. The evidence overlapped heavily with the federal record. The bomb fragments, metallurgical comparisons, typewriter analysis, and postal routes. But under Alabama law, the killing of a judge constituted an aggravating factor qualifying for the death penalty. The state sought not life imprisonment, but execution. The transfer process required meticulous coordination between federal and state authorities. In 1994, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals authorized Alabama to proceed with prosecution, while Moody remained in federal custody. His physical transfer to the Jefferson County Jail occurred under the tightest security measures in the state's history. Convoy vehicles moved under armed escort, accompanied by state troopers and U.S. Marshals. Road closures were temporary, traffic halted. The man whose crimes had once traveled invisibly through the postal system now moved through the open landscape, surrounded by law. The state trial opened in February 1996 in Birmingham, 7 years after the murder. The venue was selected for proximity to the crime, but fortified beyond recognition. Steel detectors framed every entrance. Courtroom benches were screened by ballistic glass. The prosecution was led by Deputy Attorney General Bill Bowen, supported by the same technical experts who had testified in the federal case. Their task was to condense years of investigation into a single irrefutable presentation for a new jury. From the outset, the proceedings mirrored the federal trial in structure, but not in scope. The state prosecution focused almost exclusively on Judge Vance's death. Its objective was narrow: to establish Moody's intent to assassinate a member of the judiciary as retaliation for perceived injustices. Prosecutors presented the familiar chain of evidence: the identical bomb construction, the postmarks, the typewriter flaws, the handwriting, and the pipe threads. The defense raised similar objections, claiming circumstantial overlap and procedural bias. The arguments had not changed. The answers had already been recorded. The key difference lay in motive. While the federal trial emphasized the assault on the institution of justice, the state case humanized the loss. Jurors heard testimony from investigators who had arrived at the Vance residence moments after the explosion. Photographs documented the kitchen's destruction. Medical examiners described the blast's precision and lethality. The human cost that had remained implicit in federal court now became visible evidence. The state sought not just legal closure, but moral accounting. The defense, led by court-appointed counsel, attempted to distance the 1989 bombings from the 1972 conviction, arguing that the earlier case had prejudiced public perception. But prosecutors countered with a timeline, showing continuity of obsession, supported by Moody's own letters. One exhibit displayed a handwritten note from 1988, in which he referred to the judiciary as corrupt from top to bottom, and vowed to bring balance. The phrasing was unmistakable. The man who had once appealed to judges for fairness had turned to engineering as his courtroom. Expert testimony repeated the forensic evidence in detail. The metallurgical comparisons again showed the same dye signature. The chemical analysis matched residues, and the typewriter defects remained incontrovertible. Each technical point had already survived federal scrutiny. Its reintroduction in state court reinforced its permanence. The jurors were not being asked to believe theory. They were being asked to recognize pattern. As the trial progressed, Moody maintained the same composure he had displayed in 1991. He took notes, conferred quietly with his attorneys, and occasionally stared at the evidence photographs projected before him. To observers, he seemed detached, neither remorseful nor angry, simply present. His demeanor became part of the record. The prosecution characterized it as indifference, The defense framed it as dignity. In truth, it was the same mechanical control that had guided him since 1972. When the time came for closing arguments, prosecutors built their case as a continuum. They described Moody's life as a single unbroken trajectory of resentment. From the first explosion in his home to the fatal bomb mailed to Judge Vance, every act had followed the same logic of revenge. The defense countered with appeals to reasoned doubt, suggesting the possibility of another perpetrator, but no evidence supported that speculation. The state's narrative was both comprehensive and self-contained. On February 13, 1996, after deliberating less than 4 hours, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of capital murder. The courtroom remained silent as the clerk read the decision. The penalty phase followed quickly. Jurors weighed aggravating and mitigating circumstances, guided by Alabama's capital statute. The killing of a judge performing official duties was, by definition, an aggravating factor. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The jury recommended death by a unanimous vote. Judge William Cole accepted the recommendation and formally sentenced Walter Leroy Moody Jr. to death. Following sentencing, Moody was transferred to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, home to the state's death row. He occupied a single cell, confined for 23 hours a day. Even there, his precision endured. He continued filing motions, appeals, and petitions for writs of habeas corpus. Each was drafted in his own hand, meticulously argued, dense with citations. Between 1997 and 2017, he filed dozens of appeals through state and federal courts, challenging procedural aspects of both trials, the legality of his execution method, and the constitutionality of his conviction. None succeeded. The appellate process extended for decades, moving slowly through layers of review. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, ironically, the same circuit Moody had once targeted, heard multiple petitions from him, each rejected with detailed rulings affirming the thoroughness of both prosecutions. The United States Supreme Court denied certiorari several times, allowing lower court judgments to stand. Each rejection reinforced the permanence of his sentence. The same system he had tried to destroy had absorbed and processed his every argument with methodical fairness. During his years on death row, Moody maintained his pattern of complaint and control. He wrote letters to journalists, asserting his innocence and claiming political conspiracy. He refused interviews, but corresponded with reporters and legal advocates, positioning himself as a victim of judicial vendetta. The letters bore the same slanted handwriting, the same tone of superiority. He was 82 years old when the final appeals concluded. In early 2018, the Alabama Supreme Court set an execution date for April 19th, nearly 29 years to the day after Judge Vance's death. Preparations followed standard protocol, psychological evaluations, medical assessments, and final reviews of legal standing. Federal courts denied last-minute appeals for stay of execution, citing the exhaustive appellate history and absence of new evidence. The procedural machinery of justice moved with the same precision that had characterized its investigation decades earlier. On the evening of April 19, 2018, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility. He was 83, the oldest inmate executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Witnesses described the procedure as calm, clinical, and without disruption. The Department of Corrections recorded the time of death at 8:42 p.m. The state's press release described the execution as the conclusion of a process that affirmed the rule of law. No family members were present. The man who had once sought recognition through violence left the world in silence. In the aftermath, the reaction was restrained. Federal and state officials issued brief statements, acknowledging the completion of due process. The 11th Circuit Court observed a moment of remembrance for Judge Vance's service. The Department of Justice filed the Van Pack case records into permanent archive. The investigation, trial, and execution together spanned nearly 3 decades, making it one of the longest arcs of judicial accountability in American history. If you want, I can now compile every passage you've provided, from the first 1972 bomb through the procedural record left behind filled thousands of pages. Laboratory reports, transcripts, exhibits, and rulings. It stood as a complete chronology of how law had confronted vengeance and prevailed. The system had absorbed an attack upon itself, dissected it, and answered it not through passion, but through process. In the language of the Bureau, the Van Pack case became an institutional model for multi-agency coordination, interjurisdictional prosecution, and forensic chain integration. Every academy class at Quantico studied it as an example of investigative endurance. For the judiciary, the legacy was more personal. Security protocols introduced after 1989, mail screening, facility reinforcements, threat assessment divisions, became permanent fixtures across federal circuits. Judges continued to work, to rule, to dissent, under the quiet assurance that the system could withstand even the rare violence directed against it. The name Robert Smith Vance became synonymous not only with tragedy, but with institutional resilience. Walter Leroy Moody's execution did not close the story. It completed its geometry. The man who had built machines of destruction to avenge his humiliation had been contained within the same system he tried to defy. Every phase of his life after 1972 had been defined by the law, first as defendant, then as convict, then as petitioner, and finally as prisoner. His life became an exhibit in the procedural permanence of justice. By the time of his death, the public had largely forgotten the details. For investigators and prosecutors who had built the case, the conclusion was not catharsis, but continuity. The Van Pack files remained archived in federal storage, accessible by request, each page a fragment of the machinery that had transformed an act of terror into documentation. In the quiet order of those shelves, the story ended exactly where it began, in the meticulous precision of record-keeping. From the first explosion in 1989 to the final injection in 2018, the Van Pack case spanned 29 years, nearly 3 decades of process governed by law, not vengeance. The machinery of justice had proven its endurance. The investigation had been relentless, the trials exact, the appeals exhaustive. In the end, the man who once tried to annihilate the courts became proof that their reach extended even to him. The system that he called corrupt outlived him, and for the federal agents, judges, and prosecutors who carried the case across generations, that endurance, not the verdict, not the execution, remained the truest form of justice. When the Van Pack investigation closed, it did not fade into the archive quietly. Inside the Bureau, it became a model. Every federal case that followed carried traces of its procedures, its structure, its communication network, its commitment to absolute verification. The killing of Judge Robert Vance had exposed the vulnerability of a system that prized openness, and the investigation that followed redefined how that system protected itself. Institutional change began not through legislation, but through process. The Federal Bureau of Investigation compiled its final case review in 1992. The report, over 400 pages, dissected each phase of the investigation, from December 1989 through Moody's sentencing. It was more than a narrative. It was a blueprint. The report detailed the formation of the Van Pack Task Force, the coordination between agencies, and the scientific rigor that bound the evidence chain. For the first time, the Bureau codified an integrated model, combining forensic science, behavioral profiling, postal logistics, and interagency communication. It became mandatory reading at Quantico. Within months, the lessons of Van Pack were institutionalized into new protocols. The Bureau formalized joint investigative task force procedures for crimes involving federal judges, prosecutors, or law enforcement officers. The model required immediate coordination between the FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and Postal Inspection Service, eliminating jurisdictional silos that had slowed earlier investigations. Information flow was centralized through command posts, using shared databases, an innovation in 1990 that would later become the standard for all major crimes involving explosives or domestic terrorism. The U.S. Marshals Service, responsible for judicial protection, underwent its own transformation. Prior to Van Pack, judge security had been reactive, focused on trial-based threats. The death of Judge Vance redefined that mission. The Marshals established the Judicial Security Division in 1992, expanding surveillance, risk assessment, and protective intelligence. Every sitting federal judge began receiving routine threat briefings and emergency contact protocols. Within a decade, digital threat tracking and mail screening were standard for all federal courthouses nationwide. The name Van Pack became shorthand inside the Marshals Service, for the reason those programs existed. The case also reshaped interagency communication philosophy. During Van Pack, agents had operated from multiple field offices, exchanging reports through fax and courier. That inefficiency led to the Bureau's early adoption of secure electronic communications networks, allowing case files to be shared instantly across divisions. By the mid-1990s, the same principle guided the creation of the FBI Law Enforcement Online LEO network, which linked federal, state, and local agencies through encrypted databases. The lessons learned while coordinating the Moody investigation, where speed of information equaled speed of prevention, became infrastructure. Training evolved accordingly. At Quantico, the case was incorporated into the Advanced Criminal Investigative Analysis program. Recruits studied Moody not as anomaly, but as archetype, the intelligent, grievance-driven offender who weaponized technical skill against institutions. Instructors emphasized the behavioral profile built from Van Pack: narcissism, isolation, methodical patience, as a model for identifying future domestic threats. The case bridged the gap between behavioral science and applied forensics. Moody's precision forced investigators to match his logic with their own discipline. And that dual approach became doctrine. The Bureau's Explosives Response Training Center, founded later in the decade, cited the Van Pack Reconstruction Program as precedent for its modular instruction. Agents were taught not just to defuse bombs, but to reconstruct them as evidence narratives. The Vance and Robinson bombs were used as case studies in controlled forensic analysis, demonstrating how pattern recognition could trace a criminal's hand across years. The center's archives preserved photographs of the devices, the threading patterns, and the solder joints as reference materials for future training generations. The judicial branch also adapted its own systems of protection. The Administrative Office of the United States Courts established a dedicated Judicial Security Committee in 1993, coordinating with the Marshal's Service to review all courthouse mail, parking access, and residential protection procedures for federal judges. Many of these measures, once temporary, became permanent. By 1995, every circuit had implemented mail handling protocols, derived directly from the Van Pack recommendations. The assassination of a federal judge was no longer treated as an isolated event, but as an operational threat category. Inside the Department of Justice, the case reinforced the necessity of long-term coordination between prosecutors and investigative agencies. The department created formal guidelines for evidence integration between federal and state jurisdictions, ensuring that cases like Moody's could be prosecuted at multiple levels without procedural overlap or jeopardy. The dual sovereignty doctrine, once a constitutional abstraction, was now operationalized into standardized cooperation frameworks. The Moody case was cited in internal Department of Justice memoranda as proof of concept for dual-track prosecution, federal and state acting in sequence with shared evidence integrity. Academic and technical institutions soon followed. Law schools and criminal justice programs incorporated Van Pack into curricula on forensic law and judicial protection. The case was cited in professional journals as an example of judicial terrorism, prosecuted under traditional criminal law without invoking national security statutes. It demonstrated that domestic terror, even against the judiciary itself, could be contained within the boundaries of existing law. That precedent influenced future prosecutorial strategies for cases involving violence against officials, including the 2005 Chicago federal courthouse shootings and other targeted threats. Academic and technical institutions soon followed. Law schools and criminal justice programs incorporated Van Pack into curricula on forensic law and judicial protection. The case was cited in professional journals as an example of judicial terrorism, prosecuted under traditional criminal law without invoking national security statutes. It demonstrated that domestic terror, even against the judiciary itself, could be contained within the boundaries of existing law. That precedent influenced future prosecutorial strategies for cases involving violence against officials, including the 2005 Chicago federal courthouse shootings and other targeted threats. The Bureau's archival records show that Van Pack's operational lessons extended beyond bomb investigations. Its task force model became a prototype for joint terrorism task forces, known as JTTFs, formed in the 1990s. The structure, central command, shared intelligence, distributed expertise, originated in part from Van Pack's logistical blueprint. Agents who had served on the case later assumed leadership roles in forming JTTFs nationwide. The Bureau's internal doctrine credited the Van Pack operation as a precursor to the interagency integration that defined post-September 11th counterterrorism infrastructure. Financially, the investigation prompted Congress to review funding for forensic modernization. In 1993, allocations to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory increased by over 30%, specifically earmarked for explosive trace detection and digital imaging systems. The justification cited lessons learned from the Van Pack investigation in congressional hearing minutes. The federal government recognized that methodical evidence reconstruction required both manpower and technology. The Bureau's laboratories in Quantico and Huntsville became symbols of that investment. For agents involved, the transition from case to doctrine was gradual. The Van Pack field personnel returned to their divisions, carrying experience that shaped later operations. Many of them contributed to the Bureau's early domestic terrorism manuals, applying the investigative principles refined during the Moody pursuit: sequential logic, behavioral integration, absolute documentation. The case had demonstrated that persistence could overcome the camouflage of time. That idea became a moral cornerstone in Bureau culture. Judicial culture also evolved. The Administrative Office issued guidelines for personal security awareness among judges and their families. Seminars on threat recognition, travel security, and mail screening became annual requirements. Courthouses redesigned mailrooms and entry points, converting architectural openness into controlled access without abandoning transparency. The transformation was subtle but enduring. a balance between safety and principle, forged in response to one man's act of revenge. By the early 2000s, Van Pack was no longer discussed as a recent investigation, but as part of institutional heritage. Its name appeared in bureau manuals under historical case studies, explosives and judicial threats. At Quantico, new recruits studied it alongside landmark cases like Unabomber and Oklahoma City, learning how investigative precision built resilience. Its influence reached even the procedural language of reports. Chain of custody became integrity chain, reflecting the case's emphasis on unbroken evidence stewardship. In federal courts, the effect was visible in architecture and habit. Mail rooms remained fortified, judges' home addresses removed from public directories, and courthouse designs incorporated standoff distances for vehicle security. Each measure could trace its lineage to December 1989. The death of one judge had changed the daily behavior of an entire profession. Within the Bureau's archives, the Van Pack documentation remains intact. Photographs of the bomb fragments, metallurgical analyses, chain of custody logs, correspondence between field offices, and transcripts of coordination meetings. It stands as the first case where forensic reconstruction, behavioral science, and interagency cooperation operated as a single mechanism. The records show no shortcuts, no improvisations, only the incremental precision that became the standard for everything that followed. When later historians of law enforcement assessed the evolution of federal investigative practice, Van Pack appeared as the pivot between eras, from analog coordination to digital, from departmental autonomy to integration. It proved that even a crime designed to exploit bureaucratic divisions could be undone by those same institutions when they learned to act as one. Its legacy was not simply justice for a single crime, but the architecture of prevention for all that followed. By 2018, when Moody was executed, the institutions shaped by his case were unrecognizable from those he had attacked. The Bureau, the marshals, the courts, all had adapted into structures he could never have anticipated. His name, once feared, existed only as a training reference. The irony was complete. The system he sought to destroy had transformed because of him, not despite him. From 1989, through the decades that followed, the Van Pack investigation became the procedural spine of federal coordination. Every security barrier, every evidence barcode, every judicial threat assessment carried a trace of its influence. The institutional memory of the Bureau does not celebrate such cases. It preserves them as instructions. Van Pack endures not in headlines, but in protocols, a permanent procedural monument to the idea that law, when methodical, learns faster than those who try to break it. Long after the last appeal was denied, and the final sentence carried out, the Van Pack case continued to live within the architecture of American justice. It existed not as memory alone, but as framework, woven into every procedure, every layer of protection surrounding the judiciary. What began in December 1989 as an act of violence had, through the slow evolution of process, become a case study in permanence. The legacy of Walter Leroy Moody's crimes was written not in his name, but in the institutions that endured him. In the years following his execution, the Department of Justice reviewed the Van Pack case one final time. The internal audit, conducted by the Office of Legal Policy, served a dual purpose: to evaluate procedural lessons and to codify how interagency collaboration had matured since the investigation. The review confirmed what history had already suggested, that the Van Pack model of joint task forces and forensic integration had become foundational. Its structure informed protocols used in modern domestic terrorism cases, cyber investigations, and judicial threat assessments. The file that once bore the label Van Pack Task Force now appeared in training syllabi under integrated response models, judicial security and explosives analysis. The FBI's post-2018 curriculum treated the case as a historical turning point. Recruits studying forensic integrity and behavioral convergence examined it alongside more recent threats. The Bureau's instructors emphasized how Van Pack bridged eras, the analog 1980s and the digital age. It was the final major investigation completed before the internet reshaped information exchange. Its success, built on coordination rather than technology, demonstrated that disciplined structure remained the foundation of investigative strength. Modern analysts saw in Van Pack a prototype of the systems that would later manage complex digital evidence across multiple jurisdictions. The case also shaped law enforcement culture beyond the Bureau. The ATF's Explosives Enforcement Branch used it as precedent for the establishment of the National Center for Explosives Training and Research, founded in 2003. The Moody investigation was cited in the center's formation documents as the earliest demonstration of successful coordination between forensic metallurgy, postal logistics, and behavioral science. Every bomb technician trained at the facility learned about the threading marks and solder patterns that first led investigators to Moody's garage. The Van Pack devices became instructional artifacts. Evidence turned curriculum. The judicial system's transformation was equally enduring. The Administrative Office of the United States Courts adopted the Van Pack-derived security architecture as baseline protocol across all circuits. Courthouse mailrooms retained scanning systems, and all judges were placed under continuing threat assessment. Judicial security funding expanded annually, justified by the precedent of Judge Vance's assassination. The 11th Circuit, where Vance had served, maintained an annual security review under his name. Even decades later, his death defined how the courts measured safety, not as an assumption, but as a process. For the Department of Justice, the case redefined jurisdictional cooperation. The dual sovereignty prosecution, federal and state trials operating in harmony, set a legal precedent for multi-tiered accountability in cases involving both institutional and personal harm. This model influenced later high-profile prosecutions involving federal victims, including the murders of law enforcement officers and hate crimes with overlapping jurisdictions. The Tres Judicis in Refaire precision established in Van Pack ensured that evidence could move seamlessly between courts without jeopardy or contradiction. The structure was not glamorous, but it was durable. In administrative memoranda, this was referred to simply as the Vance Standard. Academia treated Van Pack as the hinge point of forensic modernization. Legal scholars cited it as the last major case to rely almost entirely on analog science. Microscopy, metallurgical comparison, chemical residue analysis, before DNA profiling, and digital forensics dominated the field. It stood as proof that accuracy did not depend on technology, but on discipline. For students of law, the case offered a study in evidentiary sufficiency, how patient accumulation could construct certainty without confession. For historians, it marked the close of an investigative era that still valued handwriting analysis and mechanical expertise as decisive proof. Within the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Moody remained an exemplar of a psychological type that reappeared throughout the 1990s. The aggrieved individual, weaponizing intellect against perceived injustice. His behavioral profile, intelligent, methodical, narcissistic, socially isolated, became a cornerstone in training modules addressing anti-government extremism and lone offender terrorism. Analysts saw in him the pattern that later defined several domestic threats: technical capability paired with ideological grievance. Van Pack thus contributed not only to procedural law but to psychological taxonomy. For investigators who had worked the original case, its endurance was both professional legacy and personal marker. Many retired in the 2000s but continued lecturing at law enforcement academies, recounting how interagency discipline had overcome a crime born of obsession. They spoke not of triumph, but of precision. The long hours spent matching threads, measuring solder and reconstructing postal routes. The heroism of Van Pack, they insisted, was bureaucratic. Men and women filling out forms, verifying data, and refusing to let complexity obscure clarity. In that insistence lay the quiet heroism of federal process. In institutional memory, Van Pack became synonymous with resilience. Inside FBI briefings, it joined a short list of historical case codes. Brinks Unabomb OK Bomb, that symbolized transformation rather than tragedy. Each represented a moment when procedure evolved to match the threat it faced. Van Pack's contribution was structural rather than technical. The idea that cooperation was not optional, but existential. The Bureau's post-incident review panels repeatedly cited it as evidence that collective analysis produced stronger results than isolated expertise. In the decades after Moody's conviction, new threats tested that philosophy. Cyber attacks, biohazard scares, and courthouse shootings demanded responses that blended the very systems Van Pack had inspired. The 2005 Chicago federal courthouse shootings, for example, were investigated under protocols that originated with the Van Pack security reforms. The FBI's rapid coordination with the Marshals Service followed playbooks derived directly from the 1990 task force design. In every instance, the Bureau's after-action reviews traced procedural ancestry back to Birmingham, Alabama, 1989. Within the federal judiciary, Judge Vance's death remained a living memory. His portrait hung in the 11th Circuit's main hallway, flanked by a bronze plaque recounting the events of December 16, 1989. Annual judicial conferences included briefings on courthouse security developments, each tracing lineage to Van Pack. His name had become shorthand for vigilance, the principle that justice, while impartial, must still defend itself against hostility. In speeches and dedications, judges referred to the Vance precedent not only as legal history, but as moral instruction. Public awareness of the case faded, but institutional memory deepened. Federal building design guidelines incorporated Van Pack-era threat assessments. Architectural standards introduced buffer zones, reinforced walls, and sealed mail handling areas. These details went unnoticed by the public, yet each bore the trace of a single case. Government archives listed the Van Pack file among the most cited internal training materials in Department of Justice history. The Bureau's 100-year anniversary exhibit, in 2008, devoted an entire section to it, under the heading Precision and Patience. Moody's execution in 2018 closed the human timeline of the case, but not its procedural resonance. The system that had pursued him for 3 decades had become his historical counterpoint. Every appeal he filed, every motion he drafted, became part of the record, demonstrating the fairness of the system he condemned. When he died, the cycle ended exactly as the Bureau intended, within the confines of law, not revenge. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice, the case's long arc validated a philosophy of endurance. Institutional justice does not move quickly. It accumulates. The Van Pack investigation had taken 2 years, the trials 5, and the appeals more than 20, yet the final outcome was exact, each step preserving the integrity of the process. When later analysts measured efficiency, they found the case inefficient by modern standards, but perfect in precision. It proved that justice, even at its slowest, could outlast fury. By the early 2020s, as domestic security threats evolved toward digital spaces, the Van Pack model continued to serve as reference. The FBI's National Academy used it in comparative courses on threat analysis, teaching new agents that all complex crimes, digital or physical, share the same core requirement: the unbroken integrity of evidence. In classrooms lined with screens, instructors projected slides of black and white photographs, Moody's workshop, the bomb fragments, the Birmingham command post. The analog past stood as compass for the digital present. Institutionally, Van Pack's influence extended beyond federal law enforcement into governance itself. Congress cited it in hearings on judicial protection budgets, using its cost-benefit precedent to justify ongoing investment in courthouse security. The Department of Homeland Security, established after 2001, integrated Van Pack's multi-agency framework into its early threat response models. The Bureau's forensic procedures became templates for interdepartmental labs, ensuring standardization across agencies. The legacy was not emotional, it was structural. Even in the Bureau's archives, the Van Pack documentation occupies a distinct place. Unlike other historical case files, it remains accessible for reference within the FBI's Forensic Science Center, continuously cited in technical manuals. The preserved evidence, pipe fragments, letters and forensic photographs, is stored under controlled conditions, not as relics, but as reference materials. In institutional terms, the case never ended. It transitioned into study. The legacy extended into law itself. The Court Security Improvement Act of 2007, though written decades later, cited earlier DOJ policy documents influenced by Van Pack. The act expanded federal protection for judges, magistrates, and their families, embedding the lessons of 1989 into statute. It formalized what the investigation had already taught, that safeguarding the judiciary is inseparable from safeguarding democracy. Among agents and analysts who entered the Bureau long after the case, Van Pack represents continuity, the assurance that precision outlasts threat. Its story is told not as legend, but as procedure, a manual written in patience, reaffirmed in every training cycle. New recruits memorize its details the way earlier generations memorized crime scene photographs, because it teaches the cost of disorder and the reward of endurance. By the late 2010s, the last surviving members of the original task force began retiring. Their exit interviews, preserved in the Bureau's Oral History Project, echo the same sentiment. The case taught the institution how to think collectively. Before Van Pack, federal investigations were vertical, each division handling its own sphere. After Van Pack, they became lateral, integrated, and adaptive. That transformation, the ability of a bureaucracy to learn, was the investigation's final victory. The Van Pack legacy is not written in headlines or verdicts, but in procedures still practiced daily. Every time a package enters a courthouse mailroom, it is scanned under protocols born from that winter of 1989. Every interagency meeting that begins with shared databases echoes its task force model. Every forensic chain that maintains digital or physical integrity carries its philosophy forward. The system it fortified no longer remembers Moody as a man, but as a problem solved, methodically, completely, within the law. 3 decades after a small brown parcel exploded in Birmingham, the case that began with chaos concluded as order. Van Pack's legacy remains visible only to those who work within it. The agents logging evidence, the judges opening secure mail, the technicians cataloging fragments, they are its living continuation. In the history of American justice, few cases changed so little publicly, yet so much internally. The Van Pack investigation proved that when precision replaces fear, and procedure outlasts anger, even the most deliberate act of destruction becomes a manual for resilience. That is its legacy. Law transformed into memory, and memory transformed into system. In the archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, inside a climate-controlled vault at Quantico, sits a series of gray boxes, labeled simply, VN-PAC, 1989 to 1991. Each box contains a chapter of an investigation that spanned years, crossed jurisdictions, and reshaped the very system it defended. The air in that room is kept at constant temperature and humidity. The lights remain dim, motion-activated, preserving the paper inside. Every exhibit, every wire, photograph, fragment of pipe, is cataloged with precision. The record endures in silence, long after the men and women who built it have retired. There is no ceremony around these boxes. They are not treated as relics, nor as evidence of victory. They are instruments of record-keeping, the Bureau's most sacred function. Each document represents an answer to chaos, each entry a safeguard against forgetting. The VN-PAC investigation was not merely an inquiry into murder. It was an exercise in the preservation of order. When history refers to the case, it rarely notes the weight of those files, the smell of old paper, or the neat blue ink used to sign chain of custody logs. Yet those physical details are what remain when the headlines have vanished. After Moody's execution in 2018, the Department of Justice conducted one last administrative review. The purpose was procedural, to ensure that every element of the case, from investigation through sentencing, conformed to constitutional and ethical standards. The review found no deviation. It concluded that VN-PAC had exemplified due process at every stage. The system that had been attacked for corruption had proven itself transparent under scrutiny. The man who accused the courts of injustice had been tried by them with impeccable fairness. This final audit marked the transformation of the case from living process to history. It entered the Bureau's permanent collection of major completed cases, alongside the Brinks robbery, the Unabomber investigation, and Oklahoma City. Yet within the Bureau's internal hierarchy, VN-PAC occupies a distinct category. It is the only case whose victim was a sitting federal appellate judge, and the only one that directly targeted the rule of law itself. For this reason, its preservation was prioritized, not as a story of crime, but as evidence of institutional resilience. Every decade, the FBI's Historical Office updates its case index, evaluating which investigations remain relevant for training and which transition fully to archival status. VN-PAC never left the active list. Its technical reports continue to inform explosives training. Its coordination protocols remain cited in interagency manuals. And its moral architecture, the idea that justice can outlast obsession, remains embedded in Bureau philosophy. The agents who worked the case are gone now. Their careers concluded, their names etched into internal commendation records, rather than public monuments. Yet their methodology lives on in the daily operations of the system they fortified. The chain of custody protocols they refined now govern digital evidence. The interagency coordination they pioneered became the blueprint for the Joint Terrorism Task Force system. The institutional patience they demonstrated became a measure of professional discipline. The VN-PAC case, though concluded in every legal sense, continues in procedural form every day. A silent testament that law, methodical and enduring, can outlast even those who sought to destroy it. For the judiciary, the passage of time did not diminish the significance of December 16, 1989. In Birmingham, the courthouse that once bore the weight of fear continued its routine, filings, arguments, decisions. Portraits of judges lined the hallways, including that of Robert Smith Vance. Beneath his portrait, a plaque recounts his life and the crime that ended it, not with dramatization, but with precise description. It records facts, dates, and offices held. The simplicity reflects the judiciary's philosophy, that even loss must be contained by order. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, a wreath appears near that plaque. No formal ceremony accompanies it. The gesture is quiet, institutional, and unbroken. For the judges who walk past, the symbol is not one of mourning, but of endurance. The system that Vance served, and that Moody tried to destroy, remains functional, methodical, and self-correcting. The continuity of judicial life, the hearings, filings, and rulings that occur without interruption, became the truest memorial. The Bureau's internal reflections on VN-PAC, published in the 2020 Law Enforcement Bulletin, framed it as a case study in balance, the equilibrium between human fallibility and institutional precision. Agents described the investigation as an exercise in patience under pressure, a demonstration that bureaucracy, when disciplined, could be as powerful as instinct. The report concluded with a phrase that became a quiet Bureau maxim: procedure is endurance, written into law. Outside professional circles, the case is rarely remembered. The public knows fragments: a judge killed by a mail bomb, a bomber executed decades later. The rest, the layers of evidence, the interagency coordination, the administrative reforms, exists beyond the public narrative. Yet for the institutions that inherited its lessons, the Vance case defines how memory functions. It is not retold through drama, but through continued implementation. Every courthouse mailroom that scans a package, every interagency meeting that cross-references threat data, is a living reenactment of its conclusions. The record also endures in education. At Quantico, recruits still study the Vance investigation. During their final forensic analysis course, they review photographs of the original evidence, learn the sequence of discovery, and analyze the behavioral profile. The lesson is not about triumph, but about discipline. The understanding that method is the most effective response to violence. The case remains on the syllabus, not for notoriety, but because it embodies the foundation of investigative ethics, patience, precision, and respect for process. In the federal judiciary's annual security report, Vance appears as a historical reference point, the baseline for every subsequent protection measure. The Judicial Security Division of the U.S. Marshals Service continues to cite it as the origin of its mission statement. The language is institutional, almost mechanical, yet behind it lies the echo of the assassination of a judge once seemed unimaginable. After Vance, it became a threat to be anticipated and prevented. In this transformation lies the paradox of institutional learning, progress born of tragedy. The case also serves as a template for narrative restraint. Government reports about it avoid dramatization entirely. They speak of threat actors, explosive devices, and judicial infrastructure vulnerabilities. Yet behind that sterile vocabulary lies one of the most violent episodes in American judicial history. The deliberate calm of such language is itself an act of defiance, a reminder that the rule of law answers chaos with composure. For historians of American justice, Vance occupies a quiet but central place. It bridges two historical currents, the violence of resentment and the endurance of institutions. Its documentation reveals that the system's survival depended not on force but on repetition, the steady enforcement of rules, signatures, and procedures. The very processes that Moody despised ultimately defined his legacy. His life, and the destruction he wrought, were absorbed into the paperwork of the courts he sought to undermine. In bureaucratic terms, that absorption is the purest form of justice. In a broader sense, the Vance case demonstrated how institutions transform trauma into structure. Every protocol, written in its aftermath, every law amended, became a layer of protection. Over time, those layers hardened into habit. By the 2020s, new judges and agents, who had not been alive in 1989, still operated within systems shaped by the case. The investigation's details had faded from memory, but its consequences had become invisible architecture, permanent, necessary, and unacknowledged. FBI historians often describe such cases as operational fossils, moments of evolution preserved in process. Vance remains the Bureau's most complete example. From the first report of the explosion to the final archived exhibit, every stage is documented. It is a closed loop of crime, response, justice, and preservation. Few investigations achieve that level of closure. Most fade into partial records, incomplete or unresolved. Vance ended as it began, with documentation and with order. In 2021, the Bureau quietly digitized the Vance files as part of its historical preservation initiative. Thousands of scanned pages joined the internal database, ensuring the material would remain accessible to future generations. The physical evidence, pipes, wires, and fragments, remained preserved in their original containers. The archive's purpose was not to resurrect the past, but to make it accessible to those charged with preventing its repetition. History, in this sense, is not commemoration. It is preparation. The institutional story of Vance concludes not with vengeance, but with continuity. The same federal system that absorbed the shock of a judge's assassination continues to operate, case by case, year by year, without interruption. It did not bend to fear. It adapted through structure. That adaptation, multiplied over decades, is its true legacy. When agents or clerks open the Vance boxes in the archive, what they encounter is not drama, but precision. Every page bears the imprint of meticulous control, typed reports, stapled addenda, signatures in blue ink. The details are small, but together they outline an institution that refused to collapse under pressure. The investigation began as a pursuit of a killer and ended as a testament to governance. That transformation, from reaction to endurance, defines its place in history. Today, few outside the Bureau remember the acronym. To most Americans, the name Robert Vance evokes only a footnote in judicial history. But within the corridors of federal law enforcement, Vance remains a living reference, a reminder of what patience can build when principle is tested. The law's greatest strength lies not in speed, but in permanence. That permanence is what the case preserved. In the end, the story of Van Pack is not about a crime or a criminal. It is about the quiet persistence of order. A man once sought to destroy the judiciary with precision. The judiciary answered with even greater precision. The bureau, the courts, and the law transformed violence into record, and record into endurance. That transformation is the essence of justice. Not loud, not sudden, but absolute. The gray boxes at Quantico remain sealed, labeled, and undisturbed. Their contents belong no longer to investigators or historians, but to the system itself. Within them lies the documentation of every act of patience that preserved the integrity of a nation's courts. As long as those boxes remain intact, the lesson of Van Pack endures, that even in the face of deliberate destruction, order can be rebuilt piece by piece, documented line by line, until chaos itself becomes a closed file.